How does a civilization leave behind mountains of stone and almost no final answer about how its hands truly raised them? The pyramids still stand as if they remember something history no longer speaks aloud. Between quarry dust, royal names, broken records, and the slow violence of time, there lingers the feeling that part of the story was not merely lost, but buried beneath easier explanations. So before the body sinks fully into this quiet comfort, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is truly the kind of work you enjoy here. And wherever this voice finds its listener tonight, share the place and local time resting beside them now. There are certain shapes in history that seem too calm for the weight they carry. The pyramids of Egypt are among them. They do not roar. They do not plead for attention. They simply remain, fixed against heat and wind, against empire and translation, against each century that arrives certain it will finally explain them. And yet the longer they are observed, the stranger they become. It is not because they are impossible. That word is too theatrical, too eager to turn mystery into spectacle. It is because they are too real, too measured, too deliberate, too silent. The Great Pyramid at Giza, attributed to Khufu, has been described so often that familiarity has made it appear understandable. That may be one of history's quietest tricks. Repetition can imitate knowledge. A thing named many times begins to seem solved, even when its deepest questions remain open. Schoolbooks reduce the monument to a formula of stone blocks, labour gangs, copper tools, ramps, and royal will. None of those elements are trivial. Archaeology has given serious reasons to believe that large organised workforces did gather under the authority of the Old Kingdom, and that Egypt possessed administrative power strong enough to command food, transport, stone, and time. Quarry marks, workers' villages, and inscriptions have all helped clear away older fantasies. Yet when the dust settles, another discomfort remains. Explanation exists. Final clarity does not. This is where the unease begins. The ancient Egyptians did leave records, but not the kind a later world seems to hunger for. There is no surviving manual laid beside the pyramid like a whisper addressed to the future. No complete engineering scroll, no calm, detailed account from the master architect explaining sequence, tension, error, revision, and method. What survives is partial, king lists, tomb inscriptions, religious texts, administrative fragments, later recollections, and stone itself. Stone is often the most honest witness, but it is not the most talkative one. It preserves result better than process, and so a civilization that could align, carve, transport, organize, calculate, and build on a scale still capable of humbling the modern eye has reached across millennia with its finished work, while leaving the choreography of its making strangely dim. Perhaps that should not surprise anyone. Most human knowledge is more fragile than the monuments it creates. A wall may survive where the reasoning behind it does not. A ritual may be remembered long after its meaning has thinned into gesture. A city may preserve the bones of a vanished science without preserving its living voice. History is not made only of triumphs. It is also made of breaks in transmission, of fires, floods, plunder, neglect, translation errors, priesthoods dissolved, dynasties overturned, libraries scattered, and old certainties turned into decorative myths by descendants who no longer know where those certainties came from. Egypt itself knew rupture. Its history, when seen from a distance, can look like an unbroken river of pharaohs, gods, monuments, and sun-baked continuity. But no civilization remains internally unchanged across vast spans of time. Egypt rose, centralized, fractured, recovered, reimagined itself, and was later interpreted by Greeks, Romans, medieval chroniclers, colonial expeditions, museums, national projects, and modern media. Each age touched the ruins and carried away not only objects but meanings. A monument does not simply endure, it accumulates other people's explanations. Some are careful, some are careless, Some are useful. Some become so widely repeated that they harden into comfort. And comfort is often the first layer covering a mystery. It is easy to say the pyramids were tombs because tomb is a familiar category. It is historically grounded too. Egyptian funerary culture was profound, elaborate, and inseparable from kingship. Burial complexes, mortuary temples, sacred pathways, and afterlife beliefs all support the association between pyramids and death. Yet even here the stone seems to ask for more patience. A tomb may be the answer, but perhaps not the whole answer. Why such scale? Why such precision? Why such an overwhelming fusion of geometry, orientation, labour, and symbolic order? Was the pyramid only a grave enlarged to impossible ambition? Or had burial become the visible surface of something larger, something cosmic, political, sacred, and now only partly recoverable? One need not flee into fantasy to feel this tension. In fact, fantasy often arrives too quickly, feeding on uncertainty with reckless appetite. The wiser discomfort is slower. It does not insist that aliens, vanished supermachines, or secret civilizations must fill every gap. It simply notices how modern explanation sometimes becomes thin at the edges. The listener is not asked to abandon reason, only to notice where reason has perhaps mistaken a workable model for a complete one. There is a difference. At Giza, the eye meets order before it meets emotion. Angles, mass, direction, proportion, horizon. But beneath that order lies an older human feeling. The fear that knowledge can be lost even when its products remain in plain view. This is one of the most haunting possibilities in all of history. Not that the ancients did what humans could never do, but that they did what humans can do. And then the world forgot enough of the path that later ages began staring at the destination as if it belonged to another species of mind. A technical achievement then becomes a civilizational mirror. It reflects not only what they knew, but what others later failed to keep. There are moments when the desert seems almost designed to preserve this kind of thought. Sand conceals, but it also softens. It does not erase with violence alone. It layers. It quiets edges. It makes absence feel natural. Around the pyramid plateau, entire landscapes of labour once existed. Ramps perhaps, staging grounds, workshops, barracks, bakeries, boats arriving by canal, scribes counting rations, foremen shouting, priests reciting words the workers may or may not have understood. Most of that living world is gone. What remains is the shape that consumed it. The final object survived. The breathing system around it thinned into fragments. And that may be why the pyramids continue to disturb the imagination. They are not merely old. Many things are old. They're old in a way that exposes the weakness of human continuity. Every generation likes to believe knowledge rises in a straight line. The pyramids stand there like a correction carved in limestone. They suggest that civilization is not only ascent, it is accumulation and forgetting, clarity and erosion, brilliance and silence sharing the same horizon. A people can master stone and still be misunderstood. Descendants can inherit monuments and not inherit the full grammar that brought them into being. So the first step into this long Egyptian night is not to ask, with impatient modern hunger, which single method lifted each block into place. That question matters, but it arrives too late. Before method comes worldview. Before ramps comes purpose. Before technical sequence comes the stranger question of why a civilization would gather land, labour, mathematics, ritual and monarchy into one colossal form that still unsettles the mind after 4,500 years. The desert offers no reply. The pyramid offers no confession. It keeps its lines, its mass, and its silence. And beneath that silence, another question begins to move. If later ages found the monument still standing but no longer remembered enough to explain it fully, then what exactly had already been lost before the first historian ever tried to write Egypt down? The river is often described as Egypt's gift, but gifts from the natural world are rarely simple. They arrive with conditions, with patterns that must be watched, feared, measured, and obeyed. The Nile did not merely nourish the land. It trained the imagination of those who lived beside it. Long before stone was stacked into immortal geometry, the river had already begun teaching a civilization how order could rise from repetition. Flood, retreat, sowing, harvest, mud, green growth, dry light, return. A pulse so steady that it could appear eternal, and yet so fragile that one failed season might expose how thin the boundary was between abundance and hunger. Perhaps that is where the pyramids truly begin, not in the quarry. Not in the court of a king, not in a single burst of ambition. They begin in rhythm. A civilization that watches water rise and fall for generations does not merely learn agriculture. It learns anticipation. It learns to trust cycles, to mark time, to bind labour to a larger pattern. The Nile imposed patience, but it also rewarded coordination. Canals had to be cleared, fields had to be measured after the inundation shifted their edges, storage had to be planned, surplus had to be protected. The river gave, but only to a society capable of receiving its gift with discipline. This is one of the foundations of Egypt's old power, and perhaps one of the least mysterious. Archaeology and history speak clearly enough here. The Nile Valley created conditions unusually favourable to central administration. Its narrow, fertile corridor concentrated life. Its agricultural wealth, especially under stable rule, made it possible for a governing elite to gather workers, support specialists, and sustain long-term projects. The rise of the Old Kingdom did not occur in a void. It stood on grain, taxation, record-keeping, and the slow emergence of a state strong enough to imagine that land, labour, and divine kingship belonged inside one design. Yet even this clarity carries a shadow. A fertile river can feed masons. It does not automatically teach a people how to align enormous structures with such uncanny precision. It can support bureaucracy. It does not by itself explain why monumentality in Egypt took this particular form, this strange marriage of sacred purpose and mathematical calm. Something more was present. Whether that something was simply the cumulative intelligence of generations, or the inheritance of older sacred and technical traditions now mostly dissolved, remains more difficult to say. The Nile, in its own quiet way, may have encouraged this deeper habit of thought. Every flood erased and renewed boundaries. Fields had to be recalculated, land had to be reasserted. Measurement was not an abstract amusement. It was survival translated into number and line. Some historians have long pointed to this relationship between inundation and surveying, between practical necessity and the development of geometry in its earliest useful forms. If this is true, then one may begin to glimpse how a civilization of farmers could become a civilization of builders without any magical leap in between. The river itself demanded a mind attentive to proportion, division, restoration, and orientation. Still, proportion in a field is one thing. Proportion on the scale of Giza is another. What transformed the management of floodplain life into the confidence to raise mountains of cut stone? The question remains, and questions like this often reveal how quickly modern explanation becomes satisfied once it has found the first plausible bridge. It is reasonable to say that environmental stability enabled centralization. It is reasonable to say that centralization enabled monumentality. But reasonableness is not completion. There is a quiet temptation in historical writing to stop at the first model that holds together. The listener must resist that temptation, not by rejecting the model, but by asking what it leaves undescribed. There is also the matter of memory. Civilizations do not invent themselves from nothing. By the time the Great Pyramid Age emerged, Egypt already carried pre-dynastic traditions, sacred landscapes, local cults, inherited symbols, and knowledge sedimented through generations whose names are mostly gone. A fully formed state appears in history only after a long invisible preparation. This is true of all great civilizations, but Egypt gives the impression of it more strongly than most. The monuments seem abrupt only because time has hidden the softer centuries that prepared them. Beneath every stone age of certainty lies a mud brick age of experimentation, ritual, and half-forgotten adaptation. And yet the sense of disappearance persists. It may be that the Nile preserved Egypt while also concealing how much was lost before history became legible. Early settlements erode. Organic materials vanish. Structures of wood, reed, and packed earth leave weaker signatures than royal stone. The river nourished continuity, but it also participated in burial of another kind. Floods can feed memory in one century and drown evidence in the next. What survives, therefore, gives a distorted map. The monumental becomes visible. The long apprenticeship behind monumentality fades. This imbalance has consequences. Later generations look backward and see the finished civilization more clearly than the becoming of that civilization. They see kings, pyramids, inscriptions, and divine order. They do not see, with equal clarity, the older layers of trial and error, the minor priesthoods, the practical observations of stars, the local stone traditions, the early rituals of alignment, the countless acts of correction through which a people slowly learns how to turn geography into world view. In that silence, myths of sudden greatness are born. The pyramids then appear less as the crest of a long current and more as an inexplicable eruption. The Nile discourages that interpretation, if one listens carefully. Nothing about the river is sudden in the way history later imagines. Its teaching is repetitive, seasonal, almost meditative. It forms a civilization not through revelation, but through recurrence. A king may desire immortality in a single lifetime, but the conditions making that desire actionable take centuries to mature. The river taught storage, coordination, accounting, predictability, sacred timing. It likely shaped Egyptian ideas of renewal as deeply as it shaped fields of barley. The flood returns, the sun returns, the ruler joins cosmic order. The dead are not simply gone, they enter another continuity. In such a world, perhaps a pyramid was never only a building. Perhaps it was a fixed answer to the flowing uncertainty of life by the river. Stone does what water does not. Water moves, stone remains. One nourishes the living, the other defies decay. When those two principles met within Egyptian thought, something powerful may have become possible. The Nile gave surplus and sequence. Monumentality gave permanence to that sequence. A pharaoh could then appear not merely as a ruler of people, but as guardian of order itself, the one through whom cosmic rhythm was made visible and immovable. If so, then the pyramid begins to seem less like excess, and more like metaphysics hardened into architecture. Still, even that does not quiet the deeper unease. For if the Nile gave the conditions, and kingship gave the command, and labour gave the force, then what gave the exact form? Why this precision? Why this enduring obsession with orientation? Why this scale, repeated and refined until it crossed from ambitious to unsettling? The river keeps flowing beside the old stone as if the answer were obvious. But rivers often appear wise only because they never need to explain themselves. Human beings do. An ancient Egypt, for all the grandeur it still displays, left behind a strange imbalance between what it built and what it explicitly said about the making of it. Along the Nile's banks, villages once woke before dawn to the scent of wet earth and bread ovens. Officials counted grain. Boatmen watched the current. Priests lifted their eyes toward patterns in the sky. Somewhere within that breathing world, the first conditions of the pyramids were forming, not yet in full stone, not yet in final design, but in a civilization already learning to translate rhythm into rule. And perhaps that is why the next question refuses to fade. Fertile land can sustain workers, and a stable state can command them. But what first taught Egypt to imagine that order itself could be carved into the horizon? Before the Great Pyramid ever rose against the horizon, Egypt had already been rehearsing the idea of eternity in stone. That rehearsal did not begin with perfection. It began with hesitation, with stacked forms that still seemed to be searching for their final logic. Long before Giza became the image most people carry in their minds, there were lower structures, older experiments, burials covered by mastabas, broad, flat-topped tombs built from mud brick and later stone, practical and solemn, already expressing the belief that death required architecture. These earlier forms now seem almost quiet compared to what followed, yet perhaps they are among the most important clues. They reveal that the pyramid did not suddenly appear in the Egyptian imagination fully formed, as though handed down complete from a vanished sky. It emerged through stages, through acts of refinement, correction, ambition, and risk. And still, even this developmental story leaves behind a certain unease. The speed of the ascent remains difficult to ignore. The figure who stands near the threshold of this transformation is Imhotep. His name drifts through Egyptian memory in a way both historical and luminous. He is often described as architect, high official, priest, healer, sage, a man whose identity seemed, even to later ages, too expansive to fit comfortably inside one profession. Serving under King Djoser during the Third Dynasty, he is widely associated with the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, the monument that marks one of the great turning points in architectural history. Whether later centuries embroidered his reputation is almost beside the point. They clearly remembered him as someone who had crossed a threshold, someone who had known how to build differently. The Step Pyramid still feels like a thought caught in motion. It does not yet possess the smooth, finished geometry of the later true pyramids. Instead, it rises in receding stages, as if a mastaba had begun climbing upward and then refused to stop. That shape matters. It suggests both inheritance and transformation. The old tomb form remained present, but it was multiplied vertically, lifted towards something more symbolic, more commanding, perhaps more cosmic. In that gesture, Egyptian burial architecture ceased being merely protective. It became declarative. Stone was no longer only enclosing death. It was announcing an idea about kingship, ascent, order, and permanence. Archaeology gives strong reasons to see this as a real historical development rather than a mystical rupture. The Step Pyramid complex at Saqqara was not an isolated structure but part of a larger ceremonial world. Courtyards, walls, shrines, spaces of movement and ritual. It reveals planning on a scale already astonishing for its time. It also shows that Egyptian builders were willing to experiment with stone as something more than a substitute for mud brick. They were testing what monumentality itself could become. Yet what lingers beneath that explanation is the pace. Within what seems, in broad historical terms, like a relatively compressed stretch of time, Egypt moved from older burial forms to increasingly ambitious pyramidal ones, as though an entire civilization had discovered not just a new building type, but a new language for power. This is where the story becomes more subtle. Development is not the enemy of mystery. In fact, development often intensifies it. To say that the pyramid evolved is correct, but evolution itself raises new questions. How did the conceptual leap happen so decisively? What converged inside the Egyptian mind that made the vertical monument suddenly feel inevitable? Was it purely political competition among kings, each seeking to outlast the last? Was it an extension of religious cosmology, perhaps an architectural answer to ideas of ascent, solar motion, or sacred order? Or had Egypt by this point already inherited a deeper body of surveying, quarrying, ceremonial geometry, and symbolic alignment whose roots stretched back farther than surviving evidence can clearly show? Saqqara encourages such questions because it feels like both a beginning and a culmination. The Step Pyramid is often presented as an early stage, and it is. But it is also already too accomplished to feel naive. One does not look at its scale, its enclosure, its integration into a ceremonial complex, and think of primitive trial. One thinks instead of a state whose imagination had already matured in ways only partly visible to later observers. The problem is that mature imagination leaves fewer footprints than finished stone. Administrative systems can be reconstructed, religious symbolism can be inferred. But the inner confidence of a civilization, the point at which it becomes capable of conceiving the immense, is more elusive. Perhaps this is why Imhotep later acquired such an aura. He did not merely build, he came to embody a memory of lost synthesis. To later Egyptians and still later admirers, he seemed to belong to that rare class of figures who unite sacred knowledge, technical mastery, and political intimacy. In a fragmented world, such people are remembered almost as miracles, yet perhaps they are only the visible surface of a culture that once made such synthesis normal. If so, then Imhotep was not a lone genius descending from nowhere, but the sharpened point of a much larger intelligence, one forged through generations of accumulated observation, ritual discipline, practical measurement, and royal ambition. After Saqqara, the experiments continued. The path toward the classic pyramid form was neither smooth nor entirely secure. The monuments associated with Sneferu, especially the bent pyramid and the red pyramid, still preserve something deeply human: correction. The bent pyramid, with its changed angle partway upward, feels almost intimate in its imperfection. A mistake, or perhaps a structural adjustment, remains visible in stone after more than 4,000 years. This matters because it reminds the listener that Egypt's builders were not magicians floating above material limits. They tested, learned, and adapted. Their monuments were not only symbols of certainty, they were also records of risk. And yet there is another way to read these experiments, not as crude attempts slowly approaching success, but as signs of a civilization recovering precision through increasingly bold execution. The distinction is subtle, but important. In one version of the story, Egypt simply invents the pyramids step by step. In another, Egypt refines and stabilizes a monumental vision that may already have existed more fully in sacred or conceptual form than the surviving structures alone reveal. The available evidence does not allow reckless certainty here, but the question remains worth holding, because the surviving timeline can sometimes feel too compressed for the scale of conceptual mastery achieved. What survives from these centuries is therefore more than architecture. It is the emotional record of a civilization growing taller in its own imagination. The tomb no longer lies low against the earth. It rises, it sharpens, it aligns itself against horizon and heaven. It becomes less a house for the dead than a statement about what rulership means in relation to the cosmos. A king is no longer merely buried beneath a structure. He is inserted into a geometry meant to outlast weather, dynasties, and memory itself. And memory is the quiet pressure behind all of this. These early pyramids are still close enough to the origin of the form that they seem to promise answers. Surely, one thinks, the beginning of the process must be easier to understand than its perfected outcome at Giza. But beginnings are often as haunted as endings. The first builders leave fewer records because institutions are still forming. Their materials are less standardized. Their innovations are less fully explained. Later ages then look backward and see only the monumental crest, while the mind that first imagined the wave has already disappeared. So the desert preserves a sequence, but not a complete confession. Mastaba becomes step, step becomes angle. Angle becomes a smoother certainty. Djoser stands at Saqqara. Sneferu experiments under a different sky. The line seems clear enough, until one asks how a civilization learned to think at this scale so quickly, and why that learning now feels only partially recoverable. By the time the pyramids at Giza come into view, they will appear less like isolated miracles and more like the culmination of a restless architectural ascent. Yet that only sharpens the next mystery. If the earlier monuments reveal experimentation, ambition, and correction, then what happened in the generations between trial and perfection that allowed Egypt to move from searching for the pyramid to seemingly mastering it? By the time the Great Pyramid enters the story, the listener may already sense a subtle shift in the air. Earlier monuments can still be read as experiments, as ambitious rehearsals in stone, as the visible signs of a civilization learning how to stretch its confidence upward. But Khufu's pyramid does not feel like a rehearsal. It feels like arrival. Not the arrival of certainty, perhaps, but the arrival of an achievement so composed, so immense, and so unnervingly exact that it forces every explanation to slow down before it speaks. There is something almost deceptive about the monument's familiarity. Images have made it ordinary. Its triangular profile has been repeated so many times across textbooks, films, logos, and postcards that the eye forgets what it is seeing. A structure originally rising to about 146.6 meters, built from millions of stone blocks, covering a base whose sides are aligned with remarkable accuracy to the cardinal directions, and positioned on the Giza plateau with an authority that seems to belong not merely to architecture, but to decision itself. To stand before it, even in imagination, is to confront a form that appears both simple and impossible to simplify. Simplicity, in this case, is one of the pyramid's great masks. The geometry is clear enough. 4 sloping faces meeting toward the sky, a square base, an overwhelming mass distributed with calm. Yet within that apparent simplicity lies an astonishing density of intention. The levelling of the foundation alone suggests extraordinary care. The orientation of the sides toward north, south, east and west is so precise that even now it continues to invite debate over how Old Kingdom surveyors achieved it. Observations of circumpolar stars, solar shadows, geometric methods using chords and sightlines. Various explanations have been proposed, and none are absurd. Ancient Egyptian priests and surveyors were capable observers of sky and land. But the deeper one follows these possibilities, the more the pyramid begins to feel like the result of a mind that did not separate engineering from cosmology. It was not merely placed on the earth. It was situated within a larger order the builders believed could be known. That may be where modern discomfort begins to sharpen. Precision is easier to admire than to interpret. A casual observer may assume that a tomb, even a royal tomb, simply grows larger according to wealth and power. But scale alone does not account for what is unsettling about the Great Pyramid. It is not just large. Many things in history are large. It is large with restraint, large without visible chaos, large in a way that suggests calculation pressed into stone over and over until deviation itself had been disciplined. The monument does not feel extravagant in the way some empires express extravagance. It feels controlled. That control raises questions not only about labour and logistics, but about purpose. Why was so much effort gathered into this one form? Why did death, kingship and mathematical order converge here with such severity? The conventional answer remains compelling up to a point. Khufu, like other pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, ruled within a world view in which kingship was not merely political. The pharaoh existed at the threshold between human society and divine order. His tomb was never simply a grave. It was part of a broader funerary complex and a sacred mechanism of continuity, intended to secure his transformation and sustain the cosmic order in which Egypt's life depended. In that sense, the Great Pyramid is not a rational excess. It is theology rendered through state power. And yet even this explanation, grounded though it is, leaves something unresolved. Theology explains why monumentality mattered. It does not fully exhaust why it took this exact form, with this exact degree of geometric calm. Perhaps the answer lies partly in the ancient Egyptian experience of order itself. To later societies, order often means administration, law, or efficiency. To Egypt, it was deeper than that. It was Ma'at, the principle of harmony, balance, truth, and proper relation between heaven, earth, king, and people. Disorder was not simply inconvenience. It was cosmic danger. The pyramid in this light begins to resemble more than a royal project. It becomes an intervention against disorder, a fixed shape placed into the world as though to assert that permanence was possible in the midst of erosion, death, and cyclical uncertainty. If so, then precision was not decorative. It was moral, sacred, necessary. Still, there is a quiet difference between understanding the symbolism of precision and understanding the means by which that precision was executed. The plateau itself offers clues, but not closure. Quarry evidence, surviving tool marks, adjacent cemeteries, workers' settlements, and the physical relationship between the pyramid and surrounding monuments all contribute to a historically grounded picture. No serious observer needs to claim magic. Human labour, organisation and skill were plainly involved. The stone was cut by human hands, moved by human effort, placed by human decision. Yet once that is granted, the true difficulty emerges more sharply, not less. Human effort on this scale becomes more impressive the more human it is. How are error margins controlled over such a vast structure? How are lines maintained? How are design intentions communicated across thousands of hands without dissolving into drift and imperfection? These are not rhetorical flourishes. They are the real questions standing inside the accepted explanation. And then there is the strange emotional force of the Great Pyramid itself. Earlier pyramids still reveal their becoming. The bent pyramid, for instance, carries the visible memory of adjustment. Khufu's pyramid feels different, not because it is flawless in an absolute sense, but because it possesses a level of completed confidence that makes later ages feel as though they have arrived too late to witness the living intelligence behind it. The monument survives, but the world that thought through it is gone. One stands before result without the full presence of process. That gap is where mystery gathers. Perhaps this is why the pyramid invites both disciplined study and reckless speculation. It exerts pressure on interpretation. Some respond by narrowing the answer until it becomes manageable. A tomb, a state project, an engineering feat, nothing more. Others respond by widening it until all restraint is lost. Hidden energies, lost super-civilizations, impossible technologies, secret sciences erased by history. Neither extreme is satisfying. The monument deserves something rarer, patience in the presence of incomplete understanding. If one looks carefully, the Great Pyramid may be telling a more humbling story. Not that ancient Egypt possessed powers beyond humanity, but that humanity under certain conditions can produce syntheses modern people find difficult to imagine. A society can unite astronomy, ritual, administration, mathematics, labour, stoneworking and sacred kingship so completely that its greatest work later appears to belong to another order of mind. The problem is not that it was inhuman. The problem may be that modern categories are too fractured to recognise what a fully integrated worldview can build. And yet one question remains like a low vibration beneath the stone. If the Great Pyramid was indeed the serene culmination of a long architectural ascent, if its proportions and orientation were the product of disciplined observation and organised labour, then why does its inner intention still feel only partly visible? Why does it continue to look from certain angles less like a monument explained by history than like a message history has only learned to paraphrase? The sun sets over Giza now as it did in Khufu's time, painting the limestone in softer tones, reducing scale into shadow. The pyramid does not defend itself against interpretation. It allows every era to approach with confidence and leave with residue of doubt. That is its peculiar power. It is not mute because it has nothing to say. It is mute because what it says may require a language of order modern minds have only partly remembered. And as the eye follows its lines upward into the darkening sky, another unease begins to form. A structure this exact, this heavy, this composed could not have emerged from intention alone. However sacred the vision may have been, stone still had to be cut, hauled and placed. The dream had to enter matter, and once that question takes hold, the listener is drawn away from the pyramid's outward perfection toward the harder world beneath it. The quarries, the tools, the river routes, the raw resistance of stone itself. Stone has a way of stripping romance from theory. From a distance, the pyramid can seem almost abstract, pure geometry resting beneath the sun, as if it belonged more to mathematics than to earth. But the moment attention returns to the material itself, the monument becomes heavier in the mind. Limestone, granite, gypsum mortar, quarry faces, transport channels, abrasion, fracture, weight. The dream of permanence had to pass through all of these. Every line that now appears serene was once entangled in dust, strain, noise, and repeated contact between human intention and unyielding matter. If the previous silence of the pyramid felt philosophical, the silence of stone feels different. It is physical. It resists imagination until imagination learns to work. Most of the Great Pyramid was built from local limestone quarried on the Giza Plateau itself, a fact that offers both comfort and complication. Comfort, because it reduces one enormous problem. Not every block had to be hauled across unimaginable distances. Complication, because even local stone remains stone. Extraction on such a scale still implies planning, cutting, sequencing, and movement through a landscape already crowded with labour. The smoother white casing stones that once covered the pyramid, many of them from the fine limestone quarries at Tura across the Nile, introduced another layer of difficulty. Then there is granite, especially the massive blocks used in chambers and relieving structures, brought from Aswan far to the south. Even if river transport made movement possible, possibility is not the same as ease. Water can carry weight. It does not remove the burden of loading, steering, unloading, and positioning with control. This is the point where historical explanation grows beautifully concrete. Boats on the Nile, seasonal floodwaters, harbours or canals reaching closer to the plateau than the modern eye expects. Sledges dragging blocks over prepared surfaces. Teams of workers coordinated through discipline and repetition. Administrative systems ensuring food, tools, and timing. Recent archaeological discoveries, including evidence associated with transport logistics and ancient waterways near Giza, have made the process feel more grounded than earlier generations once assumed. The old image of a monument appearing through some impossible mystery has been challenged by a richer, more human one. Egypt was not conjuring stone. It was organising it, and yet organisation once again does not dissolve wonder, it intensifies it. There is a temptation to believe that once the general method becomes plausible, the emotional force of the question should disappear. But when the body truly considers what is being described, the opposite happens. A sledge pulled over dampened ground is not a fantasy. It is also not a triviality. It means friction, coordination, shouted timing, rope tension, bruised shoulders, slipping feet, and the constant risk of error. A block arriving by boat from Tura or Aswan is not a miracle. It is a chain of miracles made ordinary through discipline, quarrying, loading, floating, docking, hauling, lifting, placing. Human beings become more astonishing, not less, when the explanation stays within the bounds of what human beings can actually do. But stone preserves questions differently than wood or cloth. It keeps traces that are suggestive without always being complete. Tool marks survive, though interpretation of them can remain debated. Quarry scars remain, but not always enough to reconstruct every stage of extraction. Fragments of ramps may have existed and vanished. Temporary infrastructure, almost by definition, leaves a weaker signature than the monument it serves. This is one of the deep asymmetries haunting pyramid studies. The final product was made to endure. Much of the process was not. Ancient builders may have had no reason to preserve the scaffolding of their method for the benefit of distant future minds. In their world, the method lived inside institutions, crews, and transmitted practice. Once those faded, the stone remained while the living intelligence around it evaporated. That imbalance creates space for both serious inference and restless speculation. Limestone is relatively workable compared to granite, but workable is a relative word when millions of blocks are involved. Copper tools, stone pounders, Wooden sledges and abrasives can indeed shape large quantities of stone over time. Archaeological evidence supports this. Yet hard granite still introduces another mood into the story. The blocks in the king's chamber and its relieving spaces carry a density that modern observers feel almost immediately, not because granite cannot be worked without advanced machinery, but because the scale of the effort required seems to press outward from the stone itself. The mainstream explanation remains plausible: repeated pounding, abrasion with sand, drilling with tubular tools aided by abrasives, patience beyond modern instinct. Still, some observers have pointed to certain cuts and surfaces in Egypt more broadly, and wondered whether ancient stoneworking traditions were more sophisticated, more specialized, or more varied than simplified textbook sketches usually admit. This is not the same as claiming hidden machines. It may simply mean that modern imagination is too coarse when picturing ancient craftsmanship. There is an old habit in modern culture of treating pre-modern tools as though they must produce only crude results. Yet history repeatedly humiliates that assumption. A skilled hand using simple tools over long durations inside a highly organized tradition can produce effects later societies underestimate. What disappears first is not the object, but respect for the process. Once that respect erodes, the resulting work begins to look either impossibly advanced or primitively accidental, when in truth it may belong to a third category: mastered practice that later ages no longer fully understand from within. Stone also forces a confrontation with time. The pyramid was not built in a moment of inspiration. It was built through sequences so repetitive they almost resist narrative. Lift, slide, set, adjust, cut, haul, wait, mark. Every block required not only force but placement in relation to an invisible plan. Stone is unforgiving. Misjudgment accumulates. Tiny deviations become large consequences. The calm outer geometry of the Great Pyramid therefore conceals a hidden drama of cumulative control. Someone, or rather many someones working inside an ordered system, had to ensure that mass did not become chaos. The eye now sees a unified form. The builders saw countless decisions whose coherence had to be maintained against gravity and exhaustion. And gravity itself becomes a character here. Not a metaphorical one, but an ancient adversary. Every block wanted downwardness. Every ascent required persuasion against that impulse. Whether by ramps, levers, temporary platforms, or some combination not yet fully recovered, the builders had to negotiate constantly with weight. That is why stone makes the question feel so intimate. It brings the pyramid down from the realm of abstract admiration and returns it to bodies, surfaces, and strain. One begins to sense the project not only as architecture, but as resistance conducted over years against the natural tendency of matter to remain where it lies. There is also a philosophical disturbance hidden inside all this materiality. Stone is chosen when a civilization wishes to say something to time. Mud brick shelters life, but stone confronts decay. The Egyptians understood this difference deeply. Fine limestone for visible purity, granite for endurance in critical spaces, carefully chosen materials tied not only to function, but to symbolism and permanence. The pyramid was therefore not simply assembled from available matter. It was composed. Its materials were selected within a world view, where physical durability and sacred meaning were not separate concerns. That may explain why the stone itself can feel almost ceremonial. Even before one reaches chambers, alignments, or theological interpretation, the raw fact of material choice already speaks. This was not construction in the modern utilitarian sense. It was an act of ordering the earth into a form meant to withstand forgetting. And that may be the most haunting irony of all. The monument defeated erosion better than it defeated amnesia. The stone survived. The full memory of how the stone was commanded did not. So the listener is left with a paradox carved into the plateau. Quarry marks, transport evidence, and practical models all help restore the human world behind the pyramid. They bring the monument closer, make it breathable, return its making to labour rather than legend. But the closer the material process comes into view, the more difficult another question becomes to ignore. If the stones can still be touched, measured, weighed, and traced back toward their sources, then why does the complete choreography of their ascent remain just out of reach? Perhaps the answer lies not in the stone alone, but in the people who gave it motion. For matter does not organize itself, and no block, however carefully cut, climbs toward the sky without a society prepared to place thousands of human lives beneath the same command. And once that thought appears, the pyramid changes again. It is no longer only a problem of stone. It becomes a problem of human arrangement, of labour bound to belief, and of a civilization able to persuade entire communities to spend themselves in service of an immortal shape. For a long time, the pyramid was imagined as the product of misery alone. That image still lingers in popular memory. Endless lines of slaves dragging stone beneath a merciless sun, whipped forward by a king's impossible vanity. It is a powerful picture, simple and severe, but history has slowly worn away at it. The archaeological record emerging around Giza has suggested something more complicated, and in some ways more unsettling. The builders were almost certainly not a faceless mass of chained captives in the way later imagination preferred to see them. They appear instead to have belonged to an organised labour force. Crews fed, housed, managed, and in some cases buried with a degree of respect that implies their work was not considered disposable. This correction matters, not only because it is historically important, but because it changes the kind of civilization one must picture standing behind the stone. A slave empire can force bodies to labour. A coherent sacred state can do something even more formidable. It can persuade labour to see itself as meaningful. Near Giza, discoveries of workers' settlements, bakeries, animal bones, sleeping quarters, administrative areas and cemeteries have opened a partial window into the human landscape surrounding pyramid construction. These traces suggest planning at a scale far beyond mere coercion. Bread had to be baked, beer had to be brewed, meat had to be distributed, tools had to be maintained, injuries had to be endured, the dead had to be buried. Such evidence reveals a system, not gentle, certainly not egalitarian, but ordered. It points toward rotating work crews, skilled and semi-skilled labourers, specialists, foremen, officials, and the invisible web of support without which no monument of this scale could have advanced even a few courses upward. There is something almost more haunting in this than in the old fantasy of slavery. Cruelty alone explains less than order does. Once labour becomes structured, rationed, identified, and integrated into a shared vision, the pyramid ceases to look like a simple act of domination and begins to look like a civilization-wide concentration of will. The workers become not only instruments, but participants in a system that joined kingship, religion, administration, and survival into one pattern. One need not romanticize that pattern to recognize its power. Human beings can endure extraordinary burdens when those burdens are named sacred, necessary, or eternal. Ancient Egypt had words for order more profound than mere obedience. The king did not stand at the centre of society as a political manager in the modern sense. He stood there as guarantor of Mayat, the balance that held the world together. In such a vision, building a pyramid was not simply construction. It was cooperation with cosmic stability. The monument was part tomb, part political statement, part ritual machine, part visible assurance that the relationship between heaven, land, river, gods and people had not been abandoned. If labour served that order, then labour could be understood not only as obligation, but as participation in something larger than individual life. This does not erase hardship. The workers were not drifting through sacred ecstasy beneath the sun. Bodies broke, shoulders swelled, hands blistered, backs ached. Diets, though substantial by the standards of such projects, did not abolish exhaustion. The archaeological signs of healed injuries and physical strain suggest lives spent in repeated confrontation with weight and repetition. Yet there is a difference between suffering inside pure coercion and suffering inside an order that confers identity. Even modern institutions understand this. Armies, states, temples, and empires all know that meaning multiplies endurance. The pyramid may therefore have required not only labour, but narrative. A collective story powerful enough to make labour bearable, even honourable. Some of the inscriptions found in connection with pyramid-building crews seem to preserve faint echoes of this. Names for work gangs, spirited, proud, almost playful in their own way, suggest identity within the machinery. These are small things perhaps, yet small things often reveal the human temperature of lost worlds. A crew name can carry morale, belonging, competition, and memory. It reminds the listener that a pyramid was not built by workers in the abstract. It was built by groups of people who recognized one another, sweated beside one another, complained, joked, obeyed, and returned again to the same task until stone began to rise into shape. And still, one question does not loosen its grip. Even if the workers' villages and cemeteries bring the monument closer to the human world, do they truly explain its achievement? They explain provisioning, they explain organisation, they help explain scale. But organisation is not the whole secret. A large number of people can move material without producing exactness. It takes more than manpower to preserve alignment, maintain design coherence, and translate a high-level vision into millions of correct placements. This is where the workers themselves begin to appear in a new light. Among them must have been levels of expertise now difficult to reconstruct. Quarrymen who understood fracture, haulers who knew balance and tension, masons who could read surfaces, overseers who could preserve sequence, surveyors who could keep invisible lines alive as the structure climbed. The old word labourer is too flat for such a world. It is possible that one reason the pyramid still feels mysterious is that later retellings collapsed all these distinctions into anonymous effort. The builders become a crowd, and crowds are easier to imagine than systems of skill. But every enduring work of great scale depends on layers of intelligence distributed through many hands. Someone knows the stone, someone knows the root, someone knows the angle, someone knows how much water to pour on the track, someone knows how to interpret the architect's intent when the stone at hand is imperfect, someone knows how to correct without unravelling the whole. Once this distributed intelligence disappears from history, the final object begins to seem detached from human reality. That may be one of the deepest tragedies of monumental history. The king survives in name. The workers survive in bone and fragment. The coordination between them, the living web of knowledge, fades almost entirely. Perhaps that is why the workers' remains matter so much. They do not only humanize the pyramid, they restore a truth modern spectators often resist. Civilizations do not build through genius alone. They build through countless bodies learning how to move in relation to an idea. And ideas powerful enough to organize a society are rarely technical alone. They are moral, symbolic, spiritual. Egypt could feed its workers because the Nile allowed surplus. It could command them because the state had grown strong. But it could sustain a project like Giza because a large enough portion of society accepted, or at least inhabited, a vision in which royal eternity and cosmic order were not absurd expenditures, but proper realities. This is difficult for the modern mind to inhabit fully. Much of the contemporary world has separated utility from meaning, labour from sacredness, engineering from cosmology. Egypt appears strange partly because it seems to have refused those separations. A bakery near a pyramid is not merely a support facility. It is a piece of metaphysics made practical. Bread enters bodies so that bodies can move stone so that stone can stabilize eternity. The whole chain belongs together, and yet the more coherent this becomes, the more another anxiety rises beneath it. Societies capable of such integration are powerful, but they are also fragile in a special way. When the central story weakens, the coordination weakens with it. When belief thins, institutions become shells. When crisis comes, drought, political fracture, economic strain, the same civilization that once made collective effort appear natural can begin to lose the thread-binding skill, meaning, and command into one fabric. If that happened in Egypt, then perhaps what vanished was not only method, but the social and sacred atmosphere that made method possible. The workers of Giza therefore stand at a threshold in this story. They rescue the pyramid from myth, but they do not rescue it from mystery. They remind the listener that human beings did this. They also remind the listener that human beings, under certain conditions, can organise themselves with a depth modern societies rarely sustain for long. The monument then becomes not only a question of technology, but of civilization's inner cohesion. And once that thought settles, another practical uncertainty begins to sharpen in the background. If a society of skilled crews, overseers, specialists and state support truly gave the stones their motion, then through what exact choreography did that motion rise course by course toward the sky? How did all that human arrangement become vertical method? For sooner or later the mind returns to the same severe image. The block at ground level is one problem, but the block lifted higher and higher into a growing mountain of geometry is another. Somewhere between the ordered world of the workers below and the finished calm of the pyramid above, the missing mechanics of ascent are waiting. The missing shape in the story may not be the pyramid at all. It may be the ramp. Few things in the history of ancient Egypt have inspired such a strange mixture of confidence and uncertainty. Ask how the stones rose, and the answer often arrives almost automatically. Ramps. The word has become a placeholder for explanation, a bridge laid across bewilderment, and perhaps it is deserved. Ramps are simple, practical, well within the capabilities of ancient builders, and entirely consistent with a world in which mass must be persuaded upward by effort distributed over distance. Yet the moment the mind lingers on the details, the certainty begins to thin. Not because ramps are impossible, but because each proposed ramp seems to solve one difficulty while quietly creating another. This is where the pyramid becomes less a monument and more a puzzle of vanished choreography. A straight ramp leading from the ground to the upper reaches of the monument has an immediate logic. It is intuitive, almost inevitable in the imagination. Build an inclined path, haul the stones upward, remove the ramp afterward. Simple enough in principle. But the scale of such a structure, especially if kept at a workable gradient, becomes enormous. A ramp long and broad enough to support the continuous movement of heavy blocks toward great height could require astonishing volumes of material in its own right, perhaps so much that the temporary support would begin to rival the monument it served. Then comes the question of control. How would the upper stages remain manageable as the pyramid grew taller and the working surface narrowed? A straight ramp may explain ascent, but it also produces a logistical shadow large enough to trouble the explanation, and so other theories emerged, each carrying its own fragment of plausibility. A zigzagging ramp along one face of the pyramid reduces some of the bulk required by a single direct incline. A ramp wrapping around the exterior in a spiral pattern appears at first even more elegant, allowing the structure itself to become the centre of its own ascent. Internal ramp theories, far more recent in emphasis, suggest that part of the lifting route may have been built within the monument's body, hidden from later eyes almost by design. There are also hybrid possibilities, different systems used at different phases, lower courses approached one way, upper courses another, with levers, temporary platforms, and shifts in method as the geometry changed. Each model possesses enough realism to remain alive. Each also leaves behind certain tensions, turning space for large blocks, visibility for maintaining alignment, archaeological evidence, pressure points, practicality at scale. This may be why the discussion of ramps never settles into final rest. Theories do not merely compete, they haunt one another. Archaeology has offered glimpses that matter, evidence from ancient quarry sites elsewhere in Egypt, including ramp systems associated with stone extraction and movement, demonstrates that Egyptians did in fact use inclined transport methods. This should caution against the temptation to treat ramps as a desperate modern invention. Inclined planes, sledges, ropes, lubrication, and coordinated labour belong naturally inside the technical world of ancient monumental building. The issue is not whether ramps existed. The issue is what kind, in what sequence, on what scale, and with what relationship to the finished form at Giza. There, the final clarity remains elusive, and that elusiveness is itself one of the most important facts in the story. It would be comforting to imagine that the solution simply vanished because temporary structures vanish. That may even be largely true. Mud brick, rubble, compacted earth, timber supports, and other ephemeral construction features do not survive like dressed limestone. Once the pyramid was complete, much of the apparatus around it may have been dismantled, reused, eroded, buried, or scavenged. The monument was built to endure. The means of its making were not. If so, then the absence of definitive ramp evidence is not necessarily mysterious in an exotic sense. It is the ordinary mystery produced when perishable method serves imperishable result. But ordinary mystery can still feel profound. The listener is asked to imagine the plateau not as it appears now, stripped and exposed beneath a modern sky, but crowded with temporary landscapes of effort, paths rising and bending, teams pulling in rhythm, foremen calculating pace, masons waiting above for the next block, dust collecting along edges where the final casing stones had not yet hidden the rougher body beneath, shouted corrections, delays, repairs, constant adaptation. The pyramid did not simply rise, it was surrounded by a second world, a transient architecture of labour that would later disappear so completely that future ages might mistake the finished monument for a self-contained miracle. That disappearance changes the emotional atmosphere of the question. The problem may not be that the method was unimaginable. It may be that it was too temporary to leave the kind of proof modern people crave. Still, one must be careful not to let necessity become evidence. It is easy to say a ramp must have existed, and therefore the mystery is over. But must have is not the same as known in final detail. History is full of probable mechanisms whose exact forms remain contested. The wise response is neither dismissal nor exaggeration. It is a disciplined acceptance that some of the most human parts of ancient achievement are precisely the parts least likely to survive. The more useful a temporary structure is, the less reason later builders have to preserve it once the task is complete. This is also where levers begin to enter the imagination, not always as a complete alternative to ramps, but as companions to them, especially in the upper levels where control becomes more delicate. Wooden levers, cradles, incremental lifting methods, short staging platforms. These possibilities arise because the final courses of the pyramid feel mechanically different from the early ones. What works near the ground may not work unchanged near the summit. A structure rising course by course changes the problem beneath the worker's feet. Ancient builders were surely capable of changing their solutions as the monument changed its demands. The pyramid, in that sense, was not one problem repeated. It was a sequence of evolving problems wearing the mask of one form. And perhaps this is what modern explanation sometimes struggles to admit. There may never have been a single elegant answer. There may have been phases, adaptations, compromises, and methods, chosen not because they were universally ideal, but because they were sufficiently workable inside a living project. The desire for one perfect theory may say more about modern habits of explanation than about ancient realities. Egypt may have built not with a single method, but with a flexible intelligence distributed across generations of practice and adjusted according to circumstance. If that is true, then the missing ramp is not only a missing object, it is a missing way of thinking. A civilization can know how to do something without needing to freeze that knowledge into one final written abstraction. Practice lives in bodies, crews, apprenticeship, correction, and repetition. The foreman teaches the younger hauler. The surveyor instructs the assistant. The master builder adjusts according to the stone, the weather, the grade, the available labour. Such knowledge is durable inside a living system and astonishingly fragile outside it. Once the chain breaks, descendants inherit the monument without inheriting the embedded intelligence that once made the monument feel almost procedural. That may be why ramp theories proliferate. Each one is an attempt to reverse engineer not only a mechanism, but a lost practical consciousness. Modern observers stand before finished stone and try to imagine the temporary world of movement that once surrounded it. They do so honestly and often brilliantly, yet always from the outside. The builders stood within that world. They did not need to theorize it as an archaeological absence. They breathed it. And there is one more reason the ramp question refuses to die. It is not just technical, it is symbolic. A ramp is an image of transition, of matter guided upward, of effort stretched across a slope between earth and elevation. In a civilization so deeply concerned with ascent, kingship, transformation, and the ordering of life toward the eternal, it is difficult not to feel that the very mechanics of construction must have resonated with deeper meanings. The hauling of stone upward was practical, yes, but perhaps not merely practical. In Egypt, function and symbol so often shared the same breath. So the mind circles back once more to the plateau, not empty now, but alive with temporary inclines, changing strategies, and human intelligence adapting to a monument still in the process of becoming itself. Perhaps ramps were everywhere. Perhaps they shifted, narrowed, vanished, and were replaced. Perhaps that is why the evidence feels partial rather than decisive. The final pyramid remained serene because the turbulence of method was always meant to disappear, and yet as soon as the outer mechanics begin to feel imaginable, the story opens inward again. For even if the blocks were raised by some combination of ramps, levers, and disciplined labour, another unease continues to wait inside the stone. The Great Pyramid is not mysterious only because of how its exterior mass climbed. It is mysterious because of what was being built within that mass at the same time. Chambers, passages, hidden spaces, and a deliberate interior that suggests the monument's deepest intention may not rest on the outside at all. A monument can appear fully visible and still keep its deepest intention hidden. From the outside, the Great Pyramid seems almost severe in its simplicity. 4 immense faces, a square base, a summit long since stripped of its original completion. It offers the eye a clean, commanding shape, one that appears to reveal itself at a glance. But the interior unsettles that first impression. Inside the mass of stone lies a different kind of complexity. Ascending passages, descending passages, chambers, relieving spaces, shafts whose meanings remain debated, and volumes arranged with such deliberation that the pyramid begins to feel less like a single structure than like a body containing a second, quieter architecture within itself. This interior world changes the emotional weight of the question. It is one thing to imagine enormous labour organised to raise a giant royal tomb. It is another to confront an internal design so carefully embedded that it suggests multiple layers of purpose. The descending passage cut into the bedrock and leading toward an unfinished subterranean chamber, the ascending passage rising away from that lower route, the grand gallery with its improbable height and corbelled form, like a stone throat leading upward through darkness, the so-called Queen's Chamber, oddly placed and still resistant to easy interpretation, the King's Chamber, constructed of granite and capped by relieving spaces designed to redirect the crushing burden above. Each element can be described individually. None become simple merely by being named. The conventional understanding remains significant. The pyramid was built within a funerary context, part of a wider mortuary complex tied to the afterlife of the king and the sacred ideology of Old Kingdom Egypt. That framework is not decorative. It matters profoundly. Yet the interior raises questions because it does not feel merely functional in the narrow sense. There is design here that seems to exceed straightforward burial logistics. Passageways are not just access points. Chambers are not merely cavities. The whole arrangement suggests movement, sequence, threshold, and perhaps symbolic ascent. Once the listener enters this inner geography, the pyramid begins to resemble not only a tomb, but a choreography of hidden space. This is where language itself starts to become unstable. Modern categories like engineering, religion, symbolism, and utility can still be used, but they no longer sit comfortably apart. The Grand Gallery, for example, can be described structurally, but that does not exhaust the feeling it produces. It rises with a strange dignity, too monumental for a corridor, too precise to be accidental. Some researchers have argued for practical roles in block movement or structural organization. Others have sensed ceremonial or symbolic dimensions. Neither instinct is irrational. In Egypt, the practical and the sacred were rarely isolated from one another. A passage could support construction and embody ritual transition at the same time. The same uncertainty follows the shafts extending from the upper chambers. Their interpretations have changed over time. At one point they were called ventilation shafts, a term that still survives in popular speech, though that explanation now feels far too limited. Some do not even fully exit the exterior in the way a simple ventilating system would require. Their orientation toward particular regions of the sky has invited astronomical interpretations, linking the king's afterlife journey with circumpolar stars or other celestial destinations embedded within Egyptian cosmology. Whether those associations can be established with full certainty is another matter. Still, the possibility remains powerful because it aligns with something already present throughout Egyptian thought, the conviction that death, rulership, and the heavens belong to one continuous order. This is perhaps why the interior feels so charged. It gives the impression of intention layered inside intention. A chamber is placed not only where it must be, but where it means something. A passage directs not only movement, but relation. Stone becomes a medium through which orientation, compression, ascent, concealment, and revelation are all made to cooperate. And then there is the silence of the empty spaces themselves. No intact royal mummy was found within the Great Pyramid. No obvious treasury survived in the way treasure-seeking imaginations once expected. The chamber now known as the King's Chamber holds a granite sarcophagus, but absence hangs around it. That absence has fueled centuries of speculation, much of it careless. Robbery, ancient intrusion, unfinished use, ritual transformation, symbolic construction not reducible to burial alone. Many possibilities have been proposed. What matters for the deeper atmosphere of the pyramid is not only what was lost, but how loss alters interpretation. When contents vanish, structure begins to speak louder. And when structure continues to resist easy interpretation, the whole monument starts to feel like a sentence missing key words. Modern technology has only sharpened this sensation. Scanning projects in recent years have suggested hidden voids or unexplained spaces within the Great Pyramid, including large anomalies above known areas that are still being studied and debated. Such findings do not automatically overturn established understanding, but they do remind the modern world that even now the pyramid may not have fully surrendered its internal map. That fact alone should temper both arrogance and overstatement. The monument has been entered, measured, argued over and modelled for generations, and still there are signs that portions of its interior logic remain only partially visible. This is the point where more controversial interpretations tend to gather. Some have proposed that the pyramid's chambers and corridors were designed with acoustic properties in mind, arguing that resonance may have played a ritual or symbolic role. Others have imagined initiatory uses, encoded cosmology, or functions that fall outside the standard funerary model. Many of these ideas remain highly speculative, and some wander far beyond what evidence can presently sustain. Still, it would be too easy to dismiss all unusual questions simply because a few are exaggerated. The very structure of the interior justifies a certain humility. If the pyramid was conceived by a civilization that did not divide sacred and technical thought the way modernity does, then some of its inner design may carry meanings that were simultaneously structural, ceremonial, astronomical, and theological. A modern observer often wants to isolate one purpose and remove the others. Ancient monuments rarely cooperate with that impulse. It may be wiser to imagine the inner architecture as layered rather than singular. The relieving chambers above the king's chamber are obviously structural in a direct sense, yet even there one finds the paradox of hidden intelligence. These spaces were not designed for spectacle. They were meant to do their work invisibly, carrying weight away from the chamber below. Their existence reminds the listener that much of the pyramid's genius lies not in visible grandeur, but in the internal negotiation with pressure. The builders were not only creating symbolic pathways, they were also building a stone intelligence capable of surviving its own mass. That survival may itself have been symbolic. Ancient Egypt was not merely fascinated by death. It was fascinated by continuity through death, by transformation without annihilation, by order holding firm against forces that crush, erode, and dissolve. The interior of the pyramid, with its hidden supports, rising passages, and protected chamber spaces, almost seems to dramatize that struggle in architectural form. One moves inward and upward through constriction toward a core that must remain intact. The metaphor may be tempting, but perhaps it is tempting for a reason. Egyptian monuments often make metaphor physical, and still, beneath all these reflections, one final unease remains. The interior does not only feel symbolic, it feels planned with a composure that suggests complete confidence. The people who designed these spaces were not improvising inside stone. They knew what they intended. The difficulty lies with later ages, standing inside the dark after their language of intention has faded. What appears mysterious now may once have felt perfectly coherent within a worldview no longer available in full. That is the deeper wound running through the pyramid. Not ignorance exactly, but distance. The structure has not vanished. Its logic has only become partially untranslated. In that sense, the empty chambers are not truly empty. They are crowded with missing explanations, with stripped contexts, with lost ritual voice. Each corridor seems to carry more than motion. Each shaft appears to aim at more than air. Each hidden space hints that the pyramid's outer mass was never the whole story. Whatever rose on the Giza plateau was always meant to contain another order of thought within it, one less visible, more selective, and perhaps more difficult to preserve than the monument's overwhelming form. And once the listener has entered that internal darkness, it becomes difficult not to lift the eyes upward again, beyond chamber roofs, beyond the granite beams, beyond the invisible voids and the crushing limestone above them, toward the sky that ancient Egypt watched with such disciplined devotion. For if the inner passages of the pyramid feel arranged like a language of ascent, then perhaps that language was not directed only inward, or toward the dead, but outward toward the heavens themselves. And there, among stars that outlast kingdoms, another layer of the mystery begins to turn. Night may have been one of Egypt's first teachers. Long before the pyramid rose from the plateau, before quarry dust settled on skin, before rope tightened against stone, there was the older discipline of looking upward. The sky above the Nile was not merely decoration, it was order made visible, distance made rhythmic, a vast and recurring script written in light. For a civilization that measured life through flood, season, and sacred return, the heavens were not remote. They were participatory. They governed time, stabilized ritual, and offered patterns that could be trusted more deeply than the fragile memory of any one generation. If the river taught repetition across the earth, the stars taught it across eternity. This may be why the pyramids feel strange even in daylight. Their geometry seems to belong partly to another conversation, one not limited to land, kingship, or death. A pyramid rests on earth, but it does not behave like a structure content to remain there. It points, it aligns. It gives the impression of having been placed within a larger field of relation, and once that impression takes hold, the monument begins to feel less like an isolated mass of architecture, and more like a fixed response to the sky. The cardinal precision of the Great Pyramid is often one of the first details to stir this unease. Its sides are aligned with remarkable accuracy to north, south, east, and west, a fact so frequently repeated that its strangeness can be dulled by familiarity. Yet what does such alignment truly imply? At the most practical level, it suggests surveying methods of considerable refinement. Ancient builders may have used stellar observations, shadows, chords, sight lines, and repeated geometric checks to establish orientation. None of this requires fantasy. It requires patience, skill, and a culture in which precise observation of the heavens was already meaningful. But the moment one grants that, the pyramid changes character. It is no longer merely a heavy object put in a convenient place. It is a structure disciplined into relation with the world's deeper framework. That relation was not abstract for the ancient Egyptians. The sky carried theology. The sun's daily cycle, the stars that never seemed to die, the ordered motion of celestial bodies across darkness. These were not distant curiosities, but part of the sacred language through which kingship and afterlife were understood. Certain stars, especially the circumpolar ones that never sank beneath the horizon, may have held particular significance because they seemed beyond ordinary disappearance. For a king seeking continuity beyond death, such stars were not just lights. They were models of permanence, perhaps even destinations of a sort. The royal dead, in Egyptian thought, did not simply vanish. They were translated, joined, transformed, sustained in relation to cosmic order. In that light, the pyramid becomes harder to reduce to a tomb in the modern sense. It still belongs to burial, yes. But burial here seems inseparable from celestial aspiration. The structure does not only protect a body, it positions a king within a universe. This is where the shafts extending from the upper chambers take on their deeper resonance. Their exact purpose remains debated, but astronomical interpretations have long drawn attention to their directional significance. Some researchers have suggested that they point toward regions of the sky associated with important stars or constellations meaningful in Old Kingdom cosmology. Whether every specific identification is correct is less important than the broader pattern. The inner design of the pyramid appears aware of the heavens. Stone and sky are in conversation. The sealed darkness of the chamber is not wholly closed. It has directional memory, and perhaps that memory was essential. A king buried in stone without orientation would remain merely enclosed. A king placed within a cosmological structure would remain connected. It is difficult for the modern mind to inhabit this fully because modern categories separate things the Egyptians often held together. Astronomy is now treated as science, religion as belief, architecture as engineering, kingship as politics. But in the ancient world, and especially in Egypt, those divisions blur. To observe the stars was not merely to gather data, it was to participate in sacred timing. To align a monument was not merely to display skill, it was to situate power within truth. The sky did not belong to one domain of thought, it formed the backdrop against which all domains found their proper proportion. That may explain why later ages, even when technically advanced, still feel a certain distance from Egyptian monumentality. The data can be measured, the worldview is harder to recover. A modern observer can map azimuths, calculate declinations, and test alignment theories with impressive precision. Yet the deeper atmosphere in which those acts mattered can only be approached indirectly. The pyramid therefore becomes one of those rare objects where exact measurement and emotional incompleteness grow side by side. The more carefully its relation to the heavens is studied, the more one senses that orientation alone is not the whole secret. Orientation was probably not just technical accuracy, it was a form of obedience to cosmic structure. There is also the more unsettling possibility that later Egyptian religion, as preserved in texts from different periods, may not perfectly preserve the earliest layers of meaning embedded in Old Kingdom architecture. Religious traditions evolve, symbols shift, priestly explanations adapt. A monument may outlast the exact theology that first justified its form. If so, then some celestial meanings in the pyramid may already have been partially transformed, even within ancient Egypt's own long history. By the time later texts described royal afterlife journeys among the imperishable stars, they may have been preserving, elaborating, or reframing something older. This is not an argument for hidden revelation. It is a reminder that continuity often contains reinterpretation. Even civilizations that remember themselves do not do so perfectly. That thought opens a larger and more haunting question. What if part of the pyramid's astronomical significance was obvious to its builders, but became increasingly opaque as centuries passed? What if alignment once carried a lived symbolic force that later ages, including Egypt's own descendants, inherited only as reverence without complete explanation? History offers many such examples. Ritual survives where rationale dims. Gesture remains while grammar fades. A civilization can continue honouring a pattern long after its original cosmic urgency has thinned into inherited form. If that happened here, it would explain something important about the pyramid's persistent magnetism. It continues to feel meaningful even when meaning remains partially untranslated. And still, caution is necessary. The sky is generous to projection. Once a monument is associated with stars, imagination can grow intoxicated. Every angle becomes a code, every measurement a prophecy, every chamber a machine for celestial secrets. This is where interpretation often loses discipline. Egypt deserves better than that. One need not transform the pyramid into an impossible observatory or mystical device to feel the weight of its astronomical awareness. The true wonder is already sufficient. Ancient builders, working in stone and governed by sacred kingship, created a monument whose precision suggests not only technical mastery, but an intimacy with celestial order that later ages still struggle to interpret without distortion. Perhaps that is because the heavens do something the earth does not. They humble scale. A pyramid is enormous by human standards, but beneath the stars it becomes part of a much vaster arrangement. To build in relation to that arrangement is an act of philosophical ambition. It means that the monument was never meant to be admired only from nearby. It was meant to stand inside a total world, river below, desert around, stars above, king within. The structure gathers these layers into one still form. That may be why it continues to feel so complete and so incomplete at once. Complete as object, incomplete as recovered meaning. There is a further irony here. The stars are among the most stable elements in the story, and yet their meaning is among the least stable. Their patterns endure, but human reading of them shifts across ages. A king may once have ascended toward imperishable stars. A later historian may see only myth. A modern analyst may see astronomical targeting. None of these views is entirely empty, yet between them lies the real abyss, the difference between observing the sky and living within a sky-centered civilization. The builders of the pyramid did not use the heavens as modern people use reference points. They dwelt in a cosmos where celestial regularity was part of moral and sacred reality itself. That is why the pyramid's upward silence feels so charged. It is not merely pointing, it is participating. It enters the visible order of earth and the invisible order of heaven at once. And if that is true, then the monument is not just a royal statement of power. It is an attempt to secure relationship, with cardinal space, with solar and stellar rhythm, with the continuity of kingship beyond death, perhaps even with a more ancient human longing to place permanence beneath the turning sky. The stars above Giza have watched every interpreter arrive with a different language. Priests, conquerors, chroniclers, antiquarians, engineers, tourists, theorists. Each looked upward and downward and tried to join the two. The pyramid remained still. It did not surrender a final answer. It only kept demonstrating in stone that its builders took the heavens seriously enough to bind them to architecture. And that opens the next layer of unease. If the sky mattered so deeply, and if the pyramid's outer form and hidden passages both seem arranged in dialogue with cosmic order, then how much of what later ages say about Egypt is truly Egypt speaking? And how much is the sediment of other civilizations translating the monument into their own habits of thought? For the pyramid did not pass untouched from antiquity into the present. It was seen, renamed, misread, admired, plundered, measured, appropriated, and repeatedly explained by those who inherited the stone but not the world that first raised it. A monument does not survive history untouched simply because its stones endure. The pyramid stood still, but the meanings wrapped around them never did. Every civilization that approached Egypt arrived carrying its own hunger, its own assumptions, its own preferred language of explanation. And so, the Great Pyramid was never inherited in purity. It was translated again and again by priests, invaders, chroniclers, pilgrims, treasure seekers, scholars, empire builders, tourists, and modern institutions, until the monument became not only an ancient structure, but a battlefield of interpretation. If some part of its original world has grown difficult to recover, that difficulty may not come from time alone. It may also come from the many layers of thought later ages pressed upon it. This is one of the quieter tragedies of history. Ruins are not merely eroded, they are narrated. The Greeks were among the earliest major inheritors to leave extensive written reflections on Egypt, and though their accounts preserved valuable observations, they also transformed Egypt into something legible for Greek minds. Herodotus, writing centuries after the age of the pyramid builders, recorded stories, measurements, and impressions that would echo far beyond his own time. Yet he did not stand beside Khufu's workers. He stood at a distance already full of loss, listening to priests and local informants shaped by centuries of change. His Egypt was already a remembered Egypt, filtered through the languages and priorities of another era. This does not make his testimony worthless. It makes it layered. That layering continued. Roman visitors encountered the pyramids with their own taste for grandeur, conquest, and antiquarian fascination. Later writers, moving still farther from the Old Kingdom, often approached Egypt as a land of marvels, wisdom, superstition, or faded magnificence. Each reading preserved something, but each also bent the monument toward its own intellectual habits. Then came centuries in which Christian and Islamic worlds inherited the landscape under yet different conceptual skies. Medieval interpretations could treat the pyramids as granaries, ancient storehouses, cursed remnants, relics of vanished kings, or monuments assigned new stories because older ones had already thinned beyond easy reach. What matters here is not ridicule of past misunderstanding. Misunderstanding is one of history's most human acts. What matters is the cumulative effect. A monument that outlives its original explanatory world becomes vulnerable to every later framework that seems plausible enough to settle the imagination. The listener is therefore faced with a difficult truth. Much of what has been said about the pyramids across time reveals as much about the interpreters as about Egypt itself. This becomes even more pronounced in the Age of Empire. When European powers and scholars returned to Egypt with renewed intensity, especially from the 18th and 19th centuries onward, they did not arrive empty-handed. They brought methods of measurement, cataloguing, excavation, and comparative history that genuinely expanded knowledge. But they also brought colonial attitudes, racial hierarchies, biblical fixations, civilizational competition, and the deep desire to possess the ancient world intellectually as well as materially. Obelisks were moved, mummies were unwrapped, tombs were cleared with methods that now appear violent or careless. Museums in foreign capitals became custodians of objects detached from sacred and archaeological context. Egypt was studied, but it was also consumed, and consumption changes meaning. A structure once embedded in ritual landscape becomes an object in a museum catalogue, a diagram in a surveyor's notebook, a problem in someone else's civilizational argument. Even scholarship at its most disciplined is not immune to the atmosphere of its age. Entire generations of interpretation were shaped by what questions seemed respectable, what conclusions fit imperial confidence, and what assumptions about ancient peoples were quietly taken for granted. Egypt was often admired, yet admiration itself could flatten. The pyramids became wonders, and wonder can be a subtle way of avoiding the harder labour of understanding. There is also the issue of missing context. Tomb robbery began in antiquity. Reuse of stone, damage to complexes, erosion, intrusive digging, incomplete early excavations, and centuries of plunder all work together to thin the record. What is missing from the pyramids is not only treasure or decoration, it is relational information. A broken object is one kind of loss. A broken context is another, often more devastating kind. Once inscriptions are displaced, once surrounding installations are altered, once ceremonial pathways are disturbed, later observers inherit fragments and then mistake those fragments for the full grammar of the place. That is why historical certainty around Egypt often feels both impressive and precarious. There is much that scholars know, and rightly know, yet the framework of knowing rests on remains already filtered by survival, destruction, rediscovery and reinterpretation. Knowledge grows, but it grows across damaged ground. This is where the idea of controlled knowledge begins to move from melodrama into something more intellectually serious. One need not imagine a single hidden cabal guarding the truth in darkness. History rarely works with such theatrical neatness. Control is often more diffuse. Institutions decide which questions deserve funding. Academic cultures set boundaries around what is considered serious. Political systems promote certain national narratives. Museums frame objects in ways that encourage some readings and discourage others. Popular media turns complexity into slogans. Schoolbooks compress uncertainty into digestible certainty. Over time, a civilization like Egypt can become both famous and strangely muted at once. Everywhere visible, nowhere fully heard. The pyramid is especially vulnerable to this because it sits at the intersection of too many desires. National pride wants a clear story. Academia wants methodological restraint. Popular culture wants mystery. Fringe theorists want rupture. Tourism wants spectacle. Documentary storytelling wants revelation. Each of these pressures can distort, even when acting in good faith. And so the monument becomes crowded with voices while its original voice recedes. There is a philosophical problem hidden in all of this. Modern people often imagine history as recovery, as though the past lies waiting to be excavated and correctly arranged if only enough data is gathered. But history is also mediation. The past reaches the present through chains of custody, translation, survival, and interpretation. What is absent matters as much as what is found. What later societies needed Egypt to mean shaped what they preserved, copied, admired, or dismissed. Some questions became central because they fit existing intellectual frameworks. Others were neglected because they sounded embarrassing, unanswerable, or dangerously close to speculation. This is not an argument against scholarship. It is an argument for humility within scholarship. There are clues everywhere that Egypt has already been simplified many times. The reduction of the pyramids to tombs can become too narrow when stripped of cosmology. The romantic inflation of Egypt into a land of secret universal wisdom becomes equally distorting when detached from evidence. Between these extremes lies the harder task, to recognize that the monument has passed through many hands and that every hand leaves some residue. Even the most careful historian approaches through layers of prior seeing. No one arrives at Giza with an untouched mind. The pyramid itself seems to know this, in a way only stone can know. It allows interpretation, yet never quite yields to it. Greek explanations, medieval legends, Napoleonic measurements, Victorian speculation, modern archaeology, digital scans, television myths, all have circled the same mass. Each has contributed something, none has closed the case. That failure is not necessarily due to lack of intelligence. It may be due to the structure's peculiar position in history. Too much has happened around it. Too much has been lost, and too much has been projected in its place. There are times when the most unsettling thought is not that the truth was stolen, but that it was gradually diluted. A little lost in one era, renamed in another, repurposed in another, boxed into categories in another. The original atmosphere thins by degrees until future generations inherit a monument that is simultaneously documented and estranged. The shell stands, the sacred weather around it is gone. And perhaps that is why debates around the pyramid feel so charged even now. People are not only arguing about engineering or burial, they're arguing about authority. Who gets to define what the monument means, what counts as evidence, how much uncertainty is acceptable, and whether the inherited story is genuinely complete or merely institutionally comfortable. These are modern arguments, but the pyramid intensifies them because it exposes how unstable historical ownership can be. No empire, discipline, or century has managed to make the monument fully obedient to its preferred reading. That leaves the listener in a strange place. The more carefully one studies how later civilizations encountered Egypt, the more one realizes that the pyramid's mystery is not buried only under sand. It is buried under explanation. Layer after layer of commentary has settled over the stone like an intellectual sediment, sometimes clarifying, sometimes obscuring, often doing both at once. And when that sediment becomes visible, another pressure enters the story. If so much has been filtered, softened, renamed, or narrowed by later ages, then perhaps it is no surprise that alternative theories continue to gather around Giza. Some of them are wild, some disciplined, some opportunistic, some sincere. But they all grow from the same root suspicion, that what has been handed down as settled history may not be the full measure of what the stones are trying and failing to say. Once a monument begins to feel larger than the explanation surrounding it, speculation enters like wind through a crack in stone. The pyramids have lived for centuries inside that draft. It is not difficult to understand why. When a structure is both physically real and interpretively unfinished, the human mind rushes to complete it. Some people respond by narrowing the mystery until it becomes acceptable. Others widen it until it becomes myth again. And somewhere between these two instincts lies the uneasy territory in which the pyramid now resides, a place where disciplined research, provocative hypotheses, and extravagant invention all gather around the same mass of stone, each claiming to hear what the monument is really saying. This part of the story requires care. Alternative theories about the pyramids are often treated as though they emerge from pure fantasy, but that is not entirely true. Many of them grow from a genuine intuition that the standard narrative, while grounded in evidence, can sound thinner than the monument itself. People sense a gap between the accepted description and the emotional force of the object being described. That gap is enough to nourish endless reinterpretation. A theory does not need to be correct in order to reveal a real dissatisfaction. Sometimes the popularity of speculation says less about the theory than about the questions official history has not answered in a way the imagination finds complete. Among the recurring controversial ideas is the possibility of lost knowledge, not necessarily supernatural knowledge, but technical, symbolic, or civilizational depth, greater than the surviving record clearly displays. Some imagine a forgotten predecessor culture, perhaps antediluvian, whose influence lingered in Egypt. Others propose advanced surveying traditions, sophisticated stoneworking practices, or mathematical awareness that later ages underestimated. More radical voices move further still, speaking of vanished high civilizations, energy devices or hidden sciences deliberately erased. These explanations vary wildly in credibility, and many of them collapse under scrutiny, yet they persist because they serve a psychological function. They refuse to believe that so much precision, scale, and enduring mystery could emerge from a world too often described in flattened terms. The difficulty is that refusal can become either fruitful or reckless. There are, for example, legitimate reasons to take some unconventional questions seriously without surrendering to fantasy. The precision of alignment at Giza is real. The logistical sophistication required is real. The persistence of unresolved debate about certain construction details is real. The partial loss of contextual information through time is real. The tendency of modern education to reduce ancient civilizations into simplistic caricatures is also real. These conditions create an intellectual environment in which challenging established assumptions can be healthy, but healthy challenge is not the same as theatrical certainty. To say that mainstream explanation leaves open questions is honest. To claim that every open question proves a hidden civilization is not. One controversial idea that occasionally resurfaces in more technical discussions involves the possibility that some ancient stone surfaces, particularly in Egypt more broadly, reflect methods not fully captured by standard depictions of copper tools and brute abrasion alone. This need not imply impossible machinery. It may instead suggest that ancient stoneworking traditions were more varied, specialized, and refined than popular reconstructions usually convey. A culture can possess practical sophistication without resembling modern industry. That distinction is important because it allows the listener to remain open to complexity without drifting into spectacle. Another disputed area concerns the materials themselves. Some researchers outside the mainstream have proposed that at least portions of pyramid stone may have been cast or reconstituted in ways resembling geopolymer technology, rather than solely carved and placed as conventional blocks. Most Egyptologists remain unconvinced by such claims, and the dominant archaeological evidence still supports large-scale quarrying and transport of natural stone. Yet the existence of such theories reveals a broader pattern. People continue searching for models that reduce the gap between observed monumentality and the means usually imagined behind it. Whether or not the hypothesis holds, the desire behind it is revealing. It is a desire for a process that feels equal to the result. Then there are the more explicitly symbolic or energetic theories: resonance, sacred acoustics, chamber harmonics, hidden frequencies. These ideas often gather around the interior spaces of the Great Pyramid, especially the Grand Gallery and the King's Chamber. Some interpretations are wildly overstated, but the core intuition is not absurd in itself. Ancient religious architecture across many cultures often takes sound seriously. Ritual chant, reverberation, enclosed volume, and the psychological force of resonance are all historically meaningful phenomena. The problem begins when suggestive possibilities are inflated into definitive claims that the pyramid functioned as a machine in the modern technological sense. Such claims usually outrun the evidence, yet once again the reason they remain attractive is not hard to find. The inner spaces of the pyramid do not feel mute in a purely utilitarian way. They feel tuned to something, if not literally to hidden energies, then at least to experience movement threshold and controlled atmosphere. Perhaps the wiser lesson is this: the pyramid may indeed contain layers of intention. Modern categories cannot easily separate, but that does not mean every mystery conceals a lost machine. Lost civilization theories are even more dramatic. Some place Egypt as inheritor rather than originator, a late surviving branch of a much older knowledge system broken by catastrophe. Flood myths, geological disruptions, erased coastlines, and the recurring human fear of civilizational reset all feed this imagination. It is not entirely baseless to note that many ancient cultures preserve memories of prior worlds, destructions, or lost golden ages. Nor is it foolish to observe that archaeology, by its nature, works on a fragmentary record and continually revises itself. The danger appears when mythic memory is treated as direct historical proof without sufficient support. A broken record invites inference, but inference without restraint becomes self-hypnosis. Still, one should ask why the modern world is so haunted by the possibility of forgotten civilizations. Perhaps because it recognizes dimly that continuity is more fragile than progress narratives suggest. Human societies do lose knowledge. They do collapse. They do simplify their own past in order to remain comfortable in the present. The pyramid becomes a magnet for these anxieties because it stands as evidence that ancient people achieved forms of integration, technical, symbolic, political, and spiritual, that later ages have not easily replicated in the same way. To imagine a deeper lost source behind Egypt is, in part, to confess unease about how much history may already have vanished. The academic response to all this is often cautious, and understandably so. Scholarship is tasked with protecting standards of evidence against the seductions of spectacle. Without such caution, history dissolves into storytelling untethered from reality. Yet caution can sometimes harden into defensiveness. Questions that deserve patient examination may be dismissed too quickly, simply because they attract undisciplined enthusiasts. And once that happens, mistrust grows. The public senses condescension, alternative theorists sense opportunity, and the pyramid becomes caught between institutional restraint and popular overreach. That tension is itself part of the monument's modern afterlife. The listener is therefore left standing in a difficult but fertile place. It is possible to reject sensational claims and still admit that the accepted story is not emotionally or intellectually exhaustive. It is possible to respect archaeology and still recognize the fragmentary nature of the record. It is possible to suspect that some dimensions of ancient knowledge were subtler, more integrated, or more advanced in practice than modern clichés allow, without falling into fantasies of impossible technology. In fact, this middle path may be the only honest one. The pyramid deserves neither credulous worship nor dismissive domestication. What then should be done with the alternatives? Perhaps they should be treated the way one treats shadows at the edge of torchlight in a long corridor. Not every shadow is a hidden chamber. Not every movement in darkness is a revelation. But the existence of shadow still tells the observer something important. The light has not reached every surface. And maybe that is the real value of controversial theories. Even when they fail, they expose the contour of what remains unresolved. They remind the official story that it has not fully quieted the monument. They remind the listener that mystery does not disappear simply because it has been professionally managed. At the same time, they remind the restless imagination that awe is not license. Wonder must be disciplined if it is to become understanding. The pyramid stands between these two demands. It invites questions and punishes haste. It encourages skepticism and punishes arrogance. That is why it remains so difficult to inhabit without sliding toward one extreme or another. The real danger may not be believing too much, nor believing too little, but mistaking one's preferred comfort for truth. And once that unease settles in, the pyramid begins to widen again. It no longer seems like an Egyptian problem alone. The question grows larger. Why do monumental forms, sacred geometry, and megalithic ambition appear in so many distant cultures, under so many different skies? Egypt begins to lose its isolation. The listener starts to sense that Giza may be one summit in a far broader mountain range of human longing, one that stretches across continents, myths, and buried epochs, asking whether these structures were inventions of separate worlds, or echoes of a deeper pattern humanity keeps rediscovering. The pyramid begins to change the moment it is no longer seen alone. For much of this journey, Egypt has stood at the centre of the question, and rightly so. The Giza Plateau, the Old Kingdom, the Nile, the kings, the quarries, the workers, the skybound alignments, all of these belong to a world with its own unmistakable shape. Yet there comes a point when the listener, after lingering long enough in that world, begins to feel another pressure forming beyond its borders. It is the pressure of resemblance, not exact sameness, not proof of a single hidden source, but a quieter and perhaps more troubling pattern. Across distant lands and distant centuries, human beings again and again raise stone toward the sky, arranged sacred space through geometry, and built monuments that seemed meant to stand between Earth and something larger than Earth. This does not flatten Egypt into a generic mystery, quite the opposite. It sharpens the question of why Egypt feels both unique and strangely familiar. The human past is scattered with structures that echo certain pyramid-like instincts. Mesopotamian ziggurats lifted temple platforms in receding stages, not as tombs, but as elevated sacred centers joining city and heaven. In the Americas, long after the age of Khufu, step pyramids rose in Mesoamerica, tied to kingship, ritual, sacrifice, astronomy, and divine order. Elsewhere, megalithic cultures that did not build pyramids in the Egyptian sense still arranged stone with monumental intent. Circles, mounds, terraces, platforms, processional alignments, artificial hills, and chambers built to capture light, shadow, or celestial timing. The forms differ, the symbols differ, the societies differ, and yet a certain architectural instinct keeps resurfacing. The desire to stabilize meaning in mass, to raise sacred geometry out of earth, to create a fixed shape through which heaven and human order may touch. Why? There are careful answers available. Monumentality may emerge independently under comparable social conditions. Once centralized power, ritual complexity, agricultural surplus, and specialized labor converge, large ceremonial architecture becomes more likely. Height itself carries obvious symbolic force. A raised structure dominates landscape, gathers people, displays political authority, and lends sacred acts a visible stage. Geometry offers order. Repetition creates awe. Stone promises duration. None of this requires a lost global teacher whispering the same design into every civilization. Human beings may simply discover, again and again, that when they wish to make power, cosmos, and permanence visible, they are drawn towards similar solutions. That answer is reasonable. It may even be largely true, and yet reason does not entirely erase the lingering ache of the resemblance. There is something in the recurrence of these forms that presses beyond utility. Humans do not merely build large. They build symbolically upward. They create artificial mountains. They shape processional spaces. They align structures with solar or stellar events. They bind kingship, priesthood, death, sacrifice, or sacred transition into architecture that appears designed to outlast ordinary memory. It is as though monumental building answers a deep and recurring hunger in the species, a hunger not just to survive, but to orient survival within a greater pattern. The pyramid, whether in Egypt or in altered forms elsewhere, becomes less an invention than a recurring solution to a recurring metaphysical unease. Perhaps that is why Egypt does not feel diminished by comparison. It feels illuminated. For Egypt's pyramids are not merely large monuments among other large monuments. They are among the clearest expressions of a broader human tendency. They reveal, with unusual purity, the impulse to convert cosmology into form. The square base anchors, the ascending mass rises. The monument orders space around itself. It becomes a focal point where politics, mortality, celestial rhythm, and sacred legitimacy are condensed into one still presence. When similar impulses appear elsewhere, even under profoundly different cultural conditions, the listener is not necessarily looking at historical connection. The listener may be looking at the repetition of an inner architecture of human thought. Still, One must remain careful. Similarity is not proof of common origin. This warning matters because the imagination, once excited by cross-cultural echoes, can become greedy. It wants one key for every lock. It wants a vanished mother civilization, a drowned source, a hidden chain of transmission linking all great monuments into a single lost chapter of history. Such theories have emotional force precisely because they simplify the ache of recurrence. If many civilizations built sacred stone in related ways, perhaps one older civilization taught them all. It is a seductive answer, elegant in outline, difficult in proof. While diffusion between some cultures certainly occurred in many parts of history, broad global claims often outrun the evidence. Monumental resemblance can emerge through parallel development as much as through inheritance. And yet parallel development is not as plain as it first sounds. Even that explanation contains mystery. Why do human minds, separated by ocean and epoch, keep rediscovering similar relationships between height, order, sacredness, and permanence? Why do artificial mountains appear so often in civilizations concerned with cosmic legitimacy? Why does stone repeatedly become the medium through which societies negotiate death, kingship, and the heavens? These are not fringe questions. They are anthropological questions, philosophical questions, perhaps even spiritual questions. They suggest that beneath the diversity of cultures there may be recurring structures of symbolic thought more ancient than any single civilization. Egypt then begins to appear as both chapter and mirror. It is a chapter because it belongs to a specific history: Nile ecology, dynastic kingship, Old Kingdom administration, Egyptian theology, and the material conditions of northeastern Africa. Nothing should dissolve that specificity. But it is also a mirror because within its pyramids one can see reflected a pattern humanity has pursued elsewhere in different vocabulary. Build upward, align outward, stabilize meaning, give death a geometry, give power a mountain, give the sky a stone answer. Some scholars have suggested that monumentality itself may function as a form of social memory. In oral or partially literate worlds, stone can hold ideas that text alone does not yet fully govern. A monument teaches by presence. It tells descendants where the centre was. It imposes orientation on ritual and movement. It fixes cosmology into landscape so that future generations may inhabit meaning physically even if language shifts. If this is true, then the recurrence of pyramid-like architecture may indicate that many civilizations independently discovered the same truth. Memory weakens, but a shaped horizon can outlast forgetting. There is a poignancy in that thought, because it also implies failure. If monuments are built to preserve order against oblivion, then the repeated emergence of such monuments may reveal how often oblivion threatened in the first place. Artificial mountains are not only declarations of power, they may also be confessions of fragility. A civilization that builds in stone may already sense that voice, ritual, and custom are not enough. It must place its deepest convictions into mass or risk losing them to time. That possibility brings Egypt back into sharper focus. The pyramids are not mysterious merely because they are old and large. They are mysterious because they seem to have been built by a civilization already aware, perhaps dimly, of how much can vanish. The monument becomes a defense against discontinuity, and in that Egypt may not stand apart from the rest of humanity at all. It may simply stand among the clearest witnesses to a fear every civilization eventually learns, that memory frays faster than stone. There is also another unsettling possibility. Even if no single lost civilization lies behind the world's megalithic traditions, there may still be lost episodes within each region's own development. Missing layers, drowned landscapes, erased sacred sites, decayed prototypes, and broken transmissions of knowledge that make the surviving monuments appear more abrupt than they truly were. What remains visible across the globe may therefore be only the high ridges of a much larger terrain now mostly buried. Egypt's pyramids might then be neither isolated miracles nor universal copies, but one preserved peak in a wider human mountain range whose lower slopes have been consumed by erosion, flood, conquest, and time. That image is difficult to shake. One begins to imagine history not as a clean sequence of rising civilizations, but as scattered elevations protruding above a sea of loss. Giza remains visible. So do other monumental centres in other lands. Between them may lie not a direct road, but an ocean of forgotten attempts, vanished experiments, and sacred ambitions whose material traces did not survive. This is why comparison does not close the mystery. It enlarges it. The more the listener recognizes monumental echoes across the world, the less satisfying it becomes to treat Egypt as either completely isolated or fully explained. Instead, Egypt begins to feel like one of humanity's most lucid expressions of a recurring urge, to confront impermanence by building a geometry that seems capable of resisting it. That urge may be universal. The forms it takes are not. But something in the species keeps returning to stone, to height, to alignment, to the dramatic stillness of shaped mass standing beneath a turning sky. And perhaps that is the quiet revelation hidden inside the comparison. The pyramid is not only an Egyptian answer, it is a human answer spoken in an Egyptian accent. Yet that answer, like all human answers, was not eternal in practice. Egypt too would change, fracture, and lose parts of what it once knew. Monumentality could preserve presence, but not full continuity. The stones could endure while the mind that once breathed through them thinned into ritual, then memory, then puzzle. And once that truth enters the story, the next question becomes inescapable. If civilizations everywhere can build with astonishing symbolic force, can they also forget with equal force? Can a people stand beside the works of their ancestors and no longer remember how such coherence was ever possible? Civilizations do not always lose themselves in fire. Sometimes they fade through thinner things, a few failed harvests, a weakened centre, local loyalties hardening where once there had been one commanding story, the slow exhaustion of trust. The old symbols remain, the monuments still cast their shadows, the rituals continue in diminished form, and yet something essential has begun to withdraw. Looking back across Egyptian history, this quieter form of collapse may be more unsettling than catastrophe itself, because it reveals how a world capable of immense precision can unravel without ever entirely disappearing. By the end of the Old Kingdom, the same civilization that had once gathered stone, labour, theology, and royal authority into pyramids of unnerving calm began to show signs of strain. The central power of the pharaoh weakened. Provincial elites grew more assertive. Economic pressure, administrative burden, and possible environmental stress seem to have contributed to the fragmentation that later historians call the First Intermediate Period. None of this is imaginary. The historical record, though incomplete, points toward a real loosening of the old order. Yet when modern people hear the word collapse, they often imagine a theatrical ending. Egypt offers something more difficult to contemplate. A civilization can remain recognizable and still lose the living coherence that once made its greatest achievements possible. This matters because it reframes the pyramid mystery. The question is no longer only how the pyramids were built. It becomes how a society able to build them ceased to build in quite the same way. Why does a civilization reach such extraordinary integration and then fail to sustain it? The answer cannot be reduced to one cause. Civilizations are not clocks that stop for a single reason. They are ecologies of meaning and power. Once enough strands begin to fray at once, the old synthesis becomes harder to inhabit. A central state may still exist in name, but its capacity to mobilize resources weakens. Sacred kingship may still be honored, but its emotional authority thins. Skilled traditions may survive, but the conditions allowing them to converge at scale begin to disappear. This is one of history's oldest sorrows. Knowledge often dies not because it is disproved, but because the world that supported it becomes too unstable to keep transmitting it whole. The listener may be tempted to ask whether this means the pyramid builders' methods were lost entirely, not at once perhaps. Such losses are rarely immediate. Practices become narrower. Specializations lose prestige. Institutions that once trained and coordinated experts become less reliable. A later generation can still revere the old monuments, while no longer possessing the same administrative or symbolic confidence required to rival them. Memory then persists in fragments. The descendants know that greatness once stood here. They may even repeat some of the language of that greatness, but repetition is not continuity. A formula can survive where the full reasoning behind it has already dimmed. Egypt gives many hints of this tension. Later periods continue to build, restore, inscribe, reinterpret and honour what had come before. The civilization did not suddenly become ignorant. Yet the specific synthesis of the Old Kingdom, the combination of centralized labour power, royal ideology, monumental ambition, and technical concentration that produced the Great Pyramids, was not simply duplicated at will forever. That fact should trouble any simplistic notion of progress. Human societies do not move forward like a straight road. They crest, scatter, reform, and remember unevenly. Environmental stress may have played its part in this thinning of coherence. Scholars have long considered the possible role of climatic instability, including reduced Nile floods, in weakening the foundations of Old Kingdom stability. If the river's generosity faltered, then everything built upon its predictability would feel the strain. Grain surplus shrinks, distribution becomes harder, local power holders become more autonomous, confidence in the centre suffers. What looks from a distance like political fragmentation may therefore also be ecological grief expressed through institutions. The Nile, which had once taught order through recurrence, could also teach fragility when recurrence failed. And perhaps that is the first great lesson hidden behind the pyramids. Even the most ordered civilizations remain vulnerable to the rhythms beneath them. Yet environmental explanation alone cannot satisfy the deeper unease. Drought may weaken a kingdom, but it does not fully explain the fading of a worldview. The Pyramid Age was not only a logistical accomplishment, it was a style of consciousness, a way of binding death, kingship, cosmos, labour and stone into one commanding whole. When such a consciousness weakens, what is lost is not only technique, it is confidence in the reality those techniques served. The workers may still exist, the masons may still know stone, the priests may still recite inherited words. But if the civilization no longer feels held together by the same unquestioned order, then the monumental act itself becomes harder to justify, harder to coordinate, harder to believe in with the same intensity. This may be why later societies so often live among the remains of their ancestors with a mixture of pride and distance. They inherit structures whose presence they cannot deny, yet the inner necessity that produced them no longer fully lives in their own age. The monument becomes both inheritance and accusation. It says, "This was once thinkable," and by implication, something has changed. Some modern thinkers, standing before this pattern, have imagined deeper resets behind human history. Floods, forgotten prehistoric crises, cultural amnesia on a scale wider than conventional history easily admits. Such theories vary enormously in seriousness. Many are exaggerated. Some collapse into myth dressed as evidence, yet the emotional appeal behind them should not be dismissed too quickly. They arise because people sense correctly that human continuity is more fragile than official narratives often imply. Civilizations do forget. Specialized knowledge can vanish. Symbolic worlds can shatter while their monuments remain. One does not need a global cataclysm to prove this. Ordinary history is already full of it. And still, the possibility of deeper discontinuities continues to haunt the imagination. Perhaps because Egypt itself feels like a warning. Its monuments stand with such confidence that their later estrangement seems almost unbearable. If a civilization capable of this degree of integration could lose enough of itself that later ages stood among the stones in partial bewilderment, then what else in human history may have been lost without leaving such visible witnesses behind? How many traditions disappeared because they were carried in wood, voice, gesture, apprenticeship, and perishable material rather than limestone and granite? This is where the pyramid becomes less a question about ancient Egypt alone, and more a meditation on memory itself. Memory is not storage, it is maintenance. It requires institutions, beliefs, repetition, and enough stability for transmission to remain intact across generations. Once that maintenance falters, knowledge does not vanish all at once. It fragments. It becomes local, ceremonial, symbolic, misunderstood, or romanticized. A future generation may preserve the shell and call that remembrance. But shells are dangerous. They create the illusion of continuity while hiding the depth of what has been lost. The old Egyptian monuments, especially the pyramids, seem to stand precisely at that threshold. They are too great to ignore, too intact to be dismissed, too distant to be fully re-entered. They expose the weakness of every age that comes after them. Later Egyptians inherited them, Greeks measured them, Romans admired them, medieval chroniclers reinterpreted them, modern scholars analysed them, tourists photographed them. Yet none of these inheritances erased the underlying fact that the world which first raised them had already slipped away. Perhaps that is what makes the pyramids feel so emotionally cold and so spiritually charged at once. They are works of order surviving inside a world of discontinuity. They embody the human dream of permanence, while simultaneously proving that permanence of structure does not guarantee permanence of understanding. The monument remains. The living synthesis breaks. This is not merely an Egyptian tragedy. It may be one of the defining patterns of civilization itself, and if that is true, then the listener must pause before one last uncomfortable thought. The modern world often flatters itself by imagining that knowledge once discovered simply accumulates. But the pyramids suggest another possibility. Knowledge can peak, disperse, and survive only in traces. A later age can be more technologically powerful in some respects, and yet less integrated, less symbolically coherent, less capable of conceiving certain forms of total civilizational effort. Progress in one register does not prevent amnesia in another, so the desert keeps its lesson. A people can master stone and still lose the breath that once animated their mastery. Descendants can walk among perfect alignments and no longer know what inner necessity made them feel inevitable. The pyramid remains like a fossil of concentrated meaning, telling later ages not only that greatness existed, but that greatness can become unintelligible even while standing in plain sight. And once that realization settles, the monument changes again. It no longer asks only how it was built or even why. It begins to ask what kind of mind and what kind of world could hold engineering, religion, astronomy, kingship, labor, death, and eternity together so completely that they became one act. For perhaps the deepest mystery is not lost machinery or hidden chambers, but a lost wholeness of thought itself. There are moments in history when the real distance between past and present is not measured in years but in categories. The modern world has become very skilled at dividing reality into separate rooms. Engineering belongs in one room, religion in another, politics in another, astronomy in another. Death is assigned to ritual, labour to economics, geometry to mathematics, kingship to governance. This partitioning can be useful. It brings clarity, method and specialisation. But when such a mind stands before the pyramids, it may also become subtly blind. For the pyramid does not seem to have been conceived inside separated rooms. It feels as if it emerged from a civilization in which sacred meaning, technical skill, administrative force, cosmic order, and the problem of death still belong to one continuous fabric. Perhaps that is why the monument continues to resist reduction. It was built by a world whose intelligence may have been integrated in ways modern language struggles to honour. This does not require romanticising the ancient past. Egypt was not a utopia of spiritual clarity. It was hierarchical, unequal, demanding, bound to kingship, and capable of great hardness. Yet none of those truths cancel the possibility that its worldview possessed a form of coherence later societies have partly lost. The pyramid may therefore appear mysterious, not because the ancients had impossible powers, but because they did not share the same internal divisions that now shape how explanation itself is attempted. The modern observer asks, was it engineering or religion? Two more cosmic device, politics or symbolism? The ancient answer may have been something far less tidy. Yes. This possibility reorders the entire question. If the pyramid belongs to a unified worldview, then many modern debates around it may be distorted from the beginning. The problem is no longer whether one single explanation defeats the others, but whether the need for a single explanation reflects a modern habit rather than an ancient reality. The builders may not have distinguished practical and symbolic, the way later ages insist on doing. A passage could be structurally necessary and richly meaningful. A chamber could distribute weight and stage sacred transition. Orientation could be mathematically precise and cosmologically obedient. Labour could be economically organised and spiritually justified. The monument then becomes difficult to explain not because it hides one secret function, but because it fulfills many layers of function at once. That is a more demanding thought than mystery in its theatrical form. It means the listener must consider that the real enigma of the pyramids may lie not in vanished machines or forbidden archives, but in a lost style of total thinking. A civilization can become so internally coherent that its grandest creations later appear almost superhuman to descendants, who no longer know how to bind disciplines together so completely. The pyramid would then stand not as evidence of impossible technology, but as evidence of a different intellectual ecology, a world in which geometry was sacred, labour was cosmological, kingship was ontological, and stone was asked to carry meaning no modern building is usually expected to bear. This may also explain why the pyramid continues to draw such contradictory interpretations. Scholars emphasize administration, logistics, and funerary context. Spiritual interpreters emphasize symbolism, initiation, and cosmic alignment. Alternative theorists emphasize lost knowledge. Popular imagination drifts toward awe. Each of these approaches seizes on something real, yet none fully contains the monument, because each is often speaking from within a divided framework. The pyramid may not belong wholly to any one of them. It may require a way of seeing in which technical and metaphysical realities do not cancel one another, but interpenetrate. Ancient Egypt offers many hints that such a worldview truly existed. The principle of Ma'at was not a narrow doctrine. It was order in the broadest sense: truth, balance, rightful relation, cosmic stability, moral proportion. Under such a vision, the pharaoh was not merely a ruler issuing commands, he was the axis through which order was renewed between heaven and earth. Architecture, therefore, could not have been merely functional. It was one of the means by which order took visible form. A monument was not simply built within the world, it participated in maintaining the world as properly arranged. Once this is taken seriously, the pyramid becomes both more intelligible and more mysterious. More intelligible because its scale, precision, and symbolic density begin to feel proportional to the worldview that produced them. More mysterious because the modern mind no longer possesses that worldview in living form. It can study the fragments, translate the inscriptions, reconstruct the logistics, even model the stars, but it cannot fully breathe inside the same totality. That totality has become an object of scholarship rather than a habitat of consciousness. There is a loneliness in that realization. Perhaps that loneliness is what many people mistake for hidden conspiracy. They feel the gap, and rather than naming it as civilizational distance, they imagine suppressed truths locked away somewhere. Sometimes such suspicion is understandable. history really has filtered, narrowed, and controlled knowledge. But not every absence is produced by deliberate concealment. Some absences arise because worlds die from within. Their categories dissolve, their rituals lose force, their living grammar becomes artifact. In that case, what is missing is not merely a secret text or a censored fact. It is a way of inhabiting reality. That may be the most difficult loss of all to recover. The pyramid then becomes a kind of mirror held up to modern fragmentation. Contemporary civilization is brilliant in analysis, astonishing in technical reach, and powerful in ways ancient Egypt could never have imagined. And yet there is a sense in which it may also be spiritually and symbolically disassembled. It knows how to calculate, but not always how to consecrate. It knows how to build high, but not always how to make height meaningful. It knows how to produce, extract, and optimize, but often not how to unify labor, cosmos, mortality, and sacred order into one shared act. In that sense, the pyramid is not only ancient evidence, it is a critique. It asks whether modern confusion about the past is partly a confession about the present. Could it be that the monument feels alien, not because Egypt was irrational, but because modernity has become too compartmentalized to recognize a culture whose greatest works emerged from synthesis? Could it be that later explanations often sound thin because they isolate one layer of meaning and call that the whole? Could it be that the pyramid's endurance reflects not just superior stonecraft, but a civilizational confidence capable of uniting abstract thought and material execution without tearing them apart? The listener is not asked to answer these questions too quickly. The purpose of this journey has never been to replace one orthodoxy with another. It is only to notice where the stone continues to exceed the language around it. And here, near the end, that excess feels less like a technical anomaly and more like a philosophical one. The pyramid is a reminder that intelligence is not singular. Civilizations may be intelligent in different shapes. Some excel through specialization and expansion, others through concentration and symbolic coherence. Ancient Egypt may have belonged, at least for a time, to the latter kind. If so, then its monuments are not merely leftovers from a simpler world. They're condensations of a different order of mind. This also casts the disappearance of that order in a sadder light. When such coherence fades, the descendants may still preserve forms, rituals, words, and institutions, but the inner unity loosens. What was once lived whole becomes analysed in parts. The tomb remains, the theology remains, the geometry remains, the royal titles remain, yet the original force binding them all into one unavoidable vision becomes difficult to re-enter. A later scholar can describe the pieces, a later pilgrim can feel the awe, a later empire can possess the land. None of them necessarily recover the world that made the structure feel inevitable, and perhaps inevitability is the final clue. The Great Pyramid does not feel improvised. It feels as though it arose from a civilization certain enough of its own order to make stone obey a total idea. That certainty is foreign now. Its remains are visible everywhere on the plateau, yet its source lies just beyond reach, like heat above desert stone. This is why the pyramid remains so hard to domesticate intellectually. It does not merely present an engineering challenge, it presents an ontological challenge. It asks what reality looked like to those who built it. Not what tools they held in their hands alone, but what world they believed those hands belonged to. Once that question awakens, the monument becomes less a solved object than a threshold, one leading away from techniques and toward consciousness itself. And at that threshold only one final movement remains. For after all the quarry marks, labour camps, stars, chambers, forgotten methods, inherited distortions and broken continuities, the pyramid still stands where it always has, beneath wind, beneath time, beneath whatever sky now watches it. Nothing has been concluded. The stone has not confessed. It has only waited. And in that waiting, the last question gathers its full weight. Whether the real monument at Giza is not the pyramid alone, but the vast distance between what humanity can create and what it is able, in the end, to remember. Night settles over Giza more gently than one might expect. The stones do not darken all at once. They release the day slowly, holding the last warmth as the desert cools around them. Shadows lengthen across the plateau, and the great forms that seemed so absolute beneath the sun begin to soften at the edges, as though the monument is withdrawing from the certainty daylight imposed upon it. Perhaps this is the hour that suits the pyramids best. Not noon, when everything appears exposed. Not dawn, when meaning is too eager to return, but this quieter threshold, when shapes remain visible and yet begin to belong again to mystery. By now, the listener has followed the pyramid through many rooms of thought, through river and stone, through labour and stars, through broken memory and inherited explanation. The questions have not diminished. They have multiplied, though not chaotically. They have deepened. The Great Pyramid no longer appears merely as a feat of engineering, nor merely as a royal tomb, nor merely as the target of speculative hunger. It stands instead as something more difficult to dismiss and more difficult to define, a monument that forces every age to reveal the limits of its own imagination. That may be its most enduring power. Some civilizations approach Giza and see triumph, others see obsession, others see mathematics, others see theology, others see loss. Each reading touches part of the stone and mistakes the contact for completion, but the pyramid remains strangely unclaimed by every final answer. It does not reject explanation, it simply survives it. It allows itself to be measured, modelled, scanned and debated, while keeping intact the unsettling distance between what can be described and what can truly be recovered. This is not because the monument is magical. It is because human understanding is never as permanent as the structures it tries to master. There is a temptation, near the end of a journey like this, to decide at last what the pyramid really was. A tomb, certainly, within the sacred architecture of kingship and death. A political declaration, undeniably built by a state capable of concentrating land, labour and belief into an immortal form. A cosmic object, very likely, aligned and conceived within a world view in which heaven and earth were never separate realms. An engineering triumph, beyond question, though one whose practical details remain partly veiled by the disappearance of temporary worlds. A vessel of lost knowledge? Perhaps, though only if that phrase is handled with humility. Knowledge is lost in history all the time, not always through conspiracy, but through erosion, fragmentation, and the quiet death of living traditions. The pyramid may be all of these things, and still not be exhausted by any of them. That is a harder ending than revelation, but perhaps a truer one. Human beings are often comforted by conclusions because conclusions promise ownership. Once the answer is known, the object can be placed securely inside the mind. The pyramid resists that comfort. It keeps reminding the observer that some of the greatest achievements of the past are not merely problems waiting to be solved, but encounters that expose the fragility of the frameworks brought to solve them. Every interpretation of Giza says something about ancient Egypt. It also says something about the age doing the interpreting. The Greeks saw through their own horizon. Medieval travellers saw through theirs. Colonial scholars, modern archaeologists, engineers, mystics, skeptics, documentarians, tourists, all have arrived bearing the invisible architecture of their own assumptions. The pyramid received them all without changing its essential silence. This silence should not be mistaken for emptiness. Silence is sometimes the residue of too much meaning compressed into a form no longer accompanied by its living voice. A language can die while its inscriptions remain. A sacred order can vanish while its geometry continues to stand. A civilization can lose the breath that once moved through its stone, leaving descendants to admire the shell and call that knowledge. Perhaps this is why the monument continues to disturb. It is not simply old. It is old in a way that embarrasses linear notions of progress. The modern world can launch machines beyond the atmosphere, map genomes, fracture mountains, and communicate across continents in an instant. Yet none of those powers automatically restore the integrated world that produced Giza. Technical superiority in one register does not heal symbolic discontinuity in another. A later civilization may be more powerful and still stand before an older one with a peculiar feeling of incompleteness, sensing that something profound once held together there, something not reducible to tools or formulas alone. The pyramid, therefore, becomes more than an ancient structure. It becomes a question addressed to civilization itself. What allows a people to gather so many dimensions of life into one coherent act? What must be believed? What must be ordered? What must be feared? What must be hoped for a society to persuade stone into carrying eternity? And what happens when that coherence breaks? The monument stays, the quarry is empty, the work gangs disappear, the priestly language shifts, dynasties collapse, foreign powers rename the land, scholars classify what remains. The original act withdraws farther into distance, leaving only the finished outline against the sky. There is something almost unbearably human in that pattern. To build beyond one's own lifespan is already an act of faith. To build in stone is to argue against forgetfulness. Yet forgetfulness, patient and unspectacular, often wins in other ways. It may fail to topple the monument, but it hollows the living certainty that once animated it. The pyramid survives the storm and loses the sentence. It survives the empire and loses the accent. It survives the priest and loses the prayer. What remains is enough to astonish, but not always enough to restore. And still, perhaps astonishment is not failure. There are truths that cannot return as direct inheritance. They return instead as pressure, as unrest, as the refusal of an object becomes small inside explanation. The Great Pyramid may belong to that category. It does not hand the modern mind a perfect answer. It gives something stranger, a disciplined encounter with the possibility that human history is fuller of ruptures than comfort allows, and fuller of achievement than arrogance admits. It suggests that knowledge is not a staircase rising forever upward. It is a landscape of peaks and silences, of bright concentrations followed by thinning, of civilizations that remember enough to honour their ancestors, but not enough to become them again. If that is so, then the question of how the pyramids were built remains important, but it is no longer the only question, nor even the most haunting one. The deeper question is what kind of world could make such building feel necessary? Not merely possible, but necessary. What kind of relation between death and order, between kingship and cosmos, between labour and meaning, between mathematics and reverence, could condense into one mountain of stone so composed that it still unsettles those who no longer inhabit the same sky of thought? No final archive may answer that. No hidden chamber, even if one were found, could restore the entire world that once made the chamber intelligible. Discovery has limits, so does skepticism. In the end, the listener is left not with proof of some grand forbidden secret, but with something quieter and perhaps more difficult to bear, the sense that history is made not only of what happened, but of what can no longer be fully entered from where one now stands. The wind moves lightly across the plateau. It has done so through dynasties, occupations, excavations and arguments. It has passed over casing stones now gone, over work camps reduced to traces, over names once spoken daily, and now uttered only in scholarship or wonder. Above it all, the stars return in their old indifference. They are not impressed by empires. They are not troubled by interpretation. They witness the same ancient geometry still resting where human hands placed it. And perhaps that is the final unease the pyramid leaves behind. A civilization can spend itself against time with extraordinary dignity. It can shape stone so that the horizon never quite forgets. And yet the last thing it cannot secure is complete remembrance. So the pyramid remains, not as a solved machine, nor as a blank screen for fantasy, but as a patient interruption in the story people like to tell about themselves. It interrupts the easy tale of progress. It interrupts the lazy dismissal of the ancient world. It interrupts the illusion that what survives is always what was most essential. It stands there as a reminder that humanity is capable of immense coherence and immense amnesia, sometimes within the same history, sometimes within the same monument. And when the night deepens fully, the great form on the plateau begins to look less like an answer than like a thought still thinking itself across millennia. Stone lifting toward darkness, angles holding against wind, a silence so complete it almost resembles memory. Somewhere within that silence the old question remains alive, not asking only how the pyramid was built, but whether every civilization, including this one, is already building things it will one day survive without understanding. The desert offers no reply, only the shape still there,